And through all of it, in every corridor, in every anchor store, in the food court and the cinema lobby and the department store changing rooms, the air would be cool. The temperature would be steady. The light, whether from skylights above or fluorescent fixtures lining the ceiling, would be consistent and even. This was the illusion of the shopping mall. Not a deception, exactly, more a kind of carefully maintained fiction that the environment you were moving through had simply always been this way. That it required nothing. That it cost nothing. That the comfort you were experiencing was simply the natural condition of being indoors. But behind every ceiling tile, behind every ventilation grill, beneath every polished floor, was a system of staggering complexity. Ductwork that, if laid end to end, might stretch for miles. Mechanical rooms the size of houses, filled with chillers and boilers and air handling units running 24 hours a day, every season of the year. Structural systems capable of spanning distances that would have seemed impossible to builders just a generation earlier. Lighting arrays designed to mimic the quality of natural daylight, while drawing power on a scale that could illuminate a small town. Tonight, we're going to move through that world, slowly, calmly, and look at what was really happening behind the surfaces of the 1980s American shopping mall. We'll look at how these buildings were actually structured, how engineers solved the problem of spanning vast interior spaces without filling them with columns. We'll look at how the air you breathed in a mall was conditioned, moved, and replaced. We'll look at the lighting systems that made windowless corridors feel open and inviting. And we'll look at how all of these systems worked together to create an environment that felt, to the people moving through it, like it had simply always existed, effortless, stable, and utterly at ease. The mall of the 1980s was a triumph of engineering. And like most great engineering, it worked best when you couldn't see it at all. So let's begin. There is a particular kind of architecture that exists for one purpose above all others: to make you forget that time is passing. The great casinos of Las Vegas are perhaps the most famous example. No windows, no clocks, a carefully maintained environment in which the outside world simply ceases to exist, and the only reality is the one immediately in front of you. But long before the mega-resorts of the Las Vegas Strip refined this idea into something almost scientific, the American shopping mall had already quietly mastered it. Because the 1980s mall was not, at its core, simply a place to shop. It was a place to be, a destination in itself, an environment so carefully considered, so thoroughly complete, that leaving it felt like a kind of interruption, like stepping away from something that still had more to offer. This was not accidental. It was, from the very beginning, the point. To understand the ambition behind the great malls of the 1980s, it helps to think about what they were actually trying to replace. The traditional American downtown, the main street of a city or town, was a genuinely complex place. It had variety. It had texture. You might walk past a hardware store, a diner, a pharmacy, a shoe repair shop, a movie theater, a park bench, a fountain. There were places to sit and places to stand, places to eat and places to browse. The street itself was the connective tissue that held all of it together, and the act of moving through it, of walking from one thing to the next, was part of the experience. What the mall developers of the post-war decades understood was that this experience could be reproduced indoors. That the elements that made a downtown street compelling, variety, comfort, the feeling of being in a living, active place, could be translated into an enclosed environment and, crucially, improved upon. Because an indoor street had advantages that no outdoor main street could match. It was protected from the weather. It was clean. It was safe, or at least felt that way. And it could be managed, shaped, and controlled in ways that a real city street never could be. By the 1980s, this translation was essentially complete. The regional mall had become, in almost every meaningful sense, a miniature city. And like a city, it was organized around a set of spaces that served different human needs. The need to shop, certainly, but also the need to eat, to be entertained, to rest, to meet, to simply exist in the company of other people. The The physical layout of a typical 1980s regional mall reflected this urban ambition in almost every detail. At either end of the building, sometimes at 3 or 4 points in larger structures, sat the anchor stores. These were the great department stores of the era. Sears, JCPenney, Macy's, Nordstrom, Dillard's, Montgomery Ward. Each one was a substantial destination in its own right, occupying hundreds of thousands of square feet across multiple floors. In a city, these would be the landmarks, the buildings that oriented you, that gave the place its sense of scale and purpose. In the mall, they served exactly the same function. Between the anchors ran the mall corridor, the interior street. It was typically wide enough to feel genuinely open, lined on both sides by storefronts of varying sizes. The smallest of these might be a single kiosk or a narrow specialty shop. The largest might be a mid-sized retailer occupying several thousand square feet. Together they created that essential quality of variety, of a street that offered something different every few steps. And the corridor itself was not simply a passageway. It was a space in its own right. Benches were placed at regular intervals, offering places to rest. Planters filled with live or artificial greenery broke up the expanse. Fountains, almost always fountains, provided a focal point, a sense of life and movement. In the most ambitious malls, the corridor would widen at its center into a full atrium, rising through multiple levels, flooded with light from skylights above. These central spaces functioned as the town square of the indoor city. They were where mall walkers gathered in the early mornings before stores opened, where children were photographed with Santa Claus in December, where school groups paused on field trips and families arranged to meet after splitting up to shop. Food, of course, is central to any city, and by the 1980s, the mall had developed its own distinctive answer to the question of where people eat. The food court was not, strictly speaking, a new idea. Covered market halls with food vendors had existed for centuries in various forms. But the American mall food court of the 1980s was something distinctly of its time. It was a large, open seating area, typically positioned at one end of the mall or at its center, surrounded on its perimeter by a ring of individual food vendors. Each vendor occupied its own counter, its own small kingdom of fryers and warming trays and brightly lit menu boards. And the seating area in the middle belonged to everyone and no one. You could buy a slice of pizza from one counter, a soft drink from another, and sit at any of the dozens of tables arranged across the shared floor. This arrangement was, from a planning perspective, quietly ingenious. It concentrated dining traffic in a single area, which made it easier to manage, easier to clean, easier to service, easier to staff. But it also created something more than a practical solution to the question of where to put restaurants. It created a social space, a place where the activity of eating, which is inherently communal, could happen in full view of the life of the mall going on around it. You sat in the food court and watched people pass. You heard the ambient noise of the building, the distant music, the conversations, the soft mechanical hum of everything running. It was, in its own modest way, exactly the kind of street-level urban energy that the earliest mall designers had set out to recreate. But the mall of the 1980s was not content to offer only shopping and food. Entertainment had become, by this decade, an increasingly central part of the mall proposition. And the most common expression of that commitment was the multiplex cinema. The relationship between malls and movie theaters made a kind of natural sense. Both depended on foot traffic. Both benefited from the kind of extended visit that the mall was designed to encourage. A family that arrived to see a film might shop before or after. A group of teenagers who came to the mall for an afternoon might end it with a movie. And the cinema, positioned typically at one end of the building, acted as a secondary anchor, another destination that pulled visitors through the length of the corridor. The multiplexes of the 1980s were themselves a product of the same era as the mall, efficient, purpose-built, designed for volume rather than grandeur. Where the great picture palaces of an earlier era had offered a single, magnificent auditorium, the 1980s multiplex offered 4, 6, 8, or more screens showing different films simultaneously. The approach maximized attendance and minimized the risk of any single film performing poorly. And it fit perfectly within the logic of the mall. The idea that variety was the essential ingredient, that the more options available to a visitor, the longer and more comfortably they would stay. Beyond cinemas, many malls of this era included arcade game rooms, a reflection of the video game boom of the early 1980s that had made the arcade a genuine cultural institution for American teenagers. Some malls went further still, incorporating bowling alleys, ice skating rinks, miniature golf courses, or dedicated play areas for young children. The largest and most ambitious structures began to blur the line between shopping mall and full-scale entertainment complex, a direction that would reach its logical conclusion in the decades that followed. All of this, the stores, the food court, the cinema, the atrium, the seating areas, the fountains, existed within a single continuous interior environment. And that continuity was itself one of the mall's most important features. In a real city, moving between destinations means stepping outside. It means crossing streets, navigating weather, covering distances that may or may not be comfortable on foot. In the mall, every destination was connected to every other destination by the same smooth, climate-controlled corridor. You could move from the anchor store at one end to the food court at the other, without once encountering the outside world. The friction of ordinary movement, the effort that real urban navigation requires, was almost entirely eliminated. This frictionlessness was, from a commercial standpoint, enormously valuable. Research into retail behavior had long suggested that the longer a person spends in a shopping environment, the more they tend to spend. Every decision the mall made, about layout, about amenities, about seating and lighting and the placement of attractions, was in some sense aimed at extending the visit. Not through manipulation, exactly, but through genuine hospitality. By making the environment comfortable enough, interesting enough, complete enough, that there was simply no particular reason to leave. Supporting all of this, surrounding it, making it possible at the most basic logistical level, was something that almost no one thought about, and almost everyone depended upon. The parking lot. The great regional malls of the 1980s did not simply have parking. They had parking on a scale that was, by almost any other standard, extraordinary. A typical regional mall might offer 4, 5, or 6,000 parking spaces, spread across acres of asphalt surrounding the building on all or most sides. Larger malls could offer considerably more. The planning formulas used by developers in this era typically called for somewhere in the range of 4 to 5 parking spaces for every 1,000 square feet of retail space, a ratio that reflected the fundamental assumption of suburban mall design, which was that every single visitor would arrive by car. This assumption was not merely practical. It was cultural. The post-war American suburb had been built around the automobile in the most literal sense. Roads were wide, distances were long, and the car was not a luxury, but a basic precondition of participation in suburban life. The mall, as the retail and social center of that suburban world, reflected those values completely. Its parking lot was not an afterthought. It was, in many ways, the first part of the mall experience, the threshold you crossed before you ever reached the building itself. Arriving at a mall in the 1980s meant navigating that parking lot. Finding a space, ideally close to one of the anchor stores, whose entrances doubled as the main entry points to the interior. Making the short walk across the asphalt, perhaps past rows of the era's distinctive automobiles, and then stepping through those glass doors into the cool, even carefully maintained world inside. The contrast between outside and inside was part of the experience. The heat or cold of the parking lot made the comfort of the interior feel like a reward. The noise and openness of the exterior made the enclosed calm of the corridor feel like an arrival. The mall understood this contrast and used it, made the transition from outside to inside feel like a genuine passage into somewhere different. Somewhere better. Somewhere that, for a few hours at least, had everything you needed and nowhere particular you had to be. This was the mall as a miniature city. Not a perfect city, not a city in any full or democratic sense, but a carefully curated version of one. A city with no bad weather, no difficult geography, no neglected corners or uncertain neighborhoods. A city that had been planned from the beginning with a single guiding purpose: to be a place where people wanted to stay. The engineering that made this possible, the systems that kept the air cool, the lights bright, the structure standing across those extraordinary spans of open interior space, is what we'll continue to explore as the night goes on. But for now, it's enough to simply sit with the image of it. Those long, quiet corridors, the distant sound of a fountain, the soft light falling from skylights 2 floors above, the particular stillness of a mall in the early evening, when the crowds have thinned and the day is winding down and the building simply continues, steady, patient, and perfectly at ease. There is a moment that almost everyone who has spent time in a shopping mall will recognize, even if they have never had a name for it. You walked in with a purpose, a specific store, a specific thing you needed. You knew, more or less, where you were going and roughly how long it would take. And then, somewhere between the entrance and your destination, something shifted. You slowed down. Your attention moved sideways, toward a window display, toward a smell coming from a food counter, toward a sound or a color, or simply the general texture of everything around you. Your original errand didn't disappear exactly. It just receded, became less urgent, and you found yourself moving not toward a destination, but simply through a space, with no particular plan and no particular hurry. This moment has a name. It was coined in reference to Victor Gruen, the architect we met in our first segment, the man most responsible for the form the American mall eventually took. It is called the Gruen transfer, and whether or not Gruen himself intended it, and there is some historical debate on that question, it became one of the most studied and most deliberately cultivated phenomena in the entire history of retail design. Tonight we're going to look at how it worked, at the physical and psychological tools that mall designers used to shape the way people moved, the way they paid attention, and the way they experienced time inside these buildings. Because the mall, beneath its comfortable surfaces, was also a finely tuned instrument for the management of human behavior. Begin with the most fundamental element of mall design, the one that everything else was built around: the anchor store. In almost every regional mall built during the 1970s and 1980s, the building's basic structure was organized around 2 or more large department stores positioned at opposite ends of the main corridor. These were the anchors, the gravitational centers of the mall's layout. They were typically the largest tenants in the building, occupying the most square footage, generating the most foot traffic, and carrying the most name recognition. Going to the mall and going to Sears, or JCPenney, or Macy's, were often the same trip in the minds of shoppers. The anchor store was the reason you came. But from the perspective of the mall's designers and developers, the anchor store served a function that went well beyond its own retail performance. It served as a destination, a fixed point that pulled visitors through the building. If you arrived at the north entrance to reach the Sears at the south end, you had to walk the full length of the corridor to get there. And everything between the entrance and Sears, every storefront, every display window, every kiosk and cart and illuminated sign, had the opportunity to capture your attention along the way. This was the essential logic of the anchor system. The anchors generated the traffic. The corridor channeled it. And the smaller tenants lining that corridor, the specialty shops, the boutiques, the service retailers, benefited from a steady stream of visitors who had come for something else entirely, but were now, for a few seconds at least, walking past their windows. The design of those corridors was far more considered than it might appear to someone simply walking through them. Length was a primary variable. A corridor needed to be long enough to provide meaningful exposure to a large number of storefronts. Short corridors meant fewer tenants, fewer opportunities for the kind of extended wandering that mall designers wanted to encourage. But a corridor that was too long risked feeling like a march, a straight line from one point to another that shoppers would simply walk without slowing. The ideal corridor was long enough to contain variety, but broken up enough to prevent that variety from blurring into monotony. Width was equally important. Too narrow, and the corridor felt cramped, pressured, the kind of environment that made people want to move quickly rather than linger. Too wide, and the storefronts on either side began to feel distant, separated from the pedestrian flow by an expanse of open floor that disconnected the shopper from the merchandise. The sweet spot, the width that encouraged browsing, that kept visitors in natural proximity to shop windows while still allowing comfortable two-way foot traffic, was something that mall designers refined through experience over many years and many buildings. And then there were the subtler details. The placement of seating areas, which created natural pauses in the flow, moments where tired feet could rest and wandering eyes could take in a wider view of the surrounding stores. The positioning of fountains and planters and other focal points, which drew visitors toward the center of larger spaces and created visual anchors within the corridor itself. The placement of directories and signage, which provided orientation without making the building feel too legible. Because a mall that was too easy to navigate was a mall that people moved through efficiently rather than exploratively. It is worth pausing here to think more carefully about what the Gruen transfer actually describes, because it is more nuanced than simply the idea that malls confused people or tricked them into spending money. What Gruen himself was interested in, at least originally, was the psychological transition that happened when a person moved from the chaotic, demanding environment of a busy street or parking lot into the calm, controlled environment of the enclosed mall. Outside, your attention was divided: traffic, weather, navigation, the general noise of the world. Inside, those demands dropped away. The environment was simpler, more manageable, more comfortable. And as those external stresses fell away, something else happened. The purposeful, goal-directed mindset that had driven you to the mall, the errand-running, task-completing part of your brain, relaxed its grip. You became, in a word, receptive, open to what was around you rather than focused on what was ahead. This was the transfer, the shift from a directed state of mind to a more open, impressionable one. And once you were in that state, the mall's environment, with its constant visual stimulation, its variety, its careful orchestration of light and space and movement, could work on you in ways that a simple errand run could not. Whether you experienced this as pleasant wandering or as a mild loss of agency depended, perhaps, on your temperament. But the designers of 1980s malls understood it as an opportunity. If they could extend the moment of the transfer, keep visitors in that open, receptive state for as long as possible, they could extend the visit, increase the exposure to merchandise, and ultimately increase the likelihood of unplanned purchases. The physical tools available to achieve this were considerable, and by the 1980s, mall designers had developed a sophisticated vocabulary of spatial techniques for deploying them. Curves were among the most important. A straight corridor is, visually, fully legible from one end. You can see where it goes. You can see how long it is. And that legibility, that transparency, works against the sense of exploration and discovery that mall designers wanted to cultivate. A curved corridor, by contrast, always has something around the next bend. The far end is never fully visible. There is always a suggestion of more stores, more activity, more of the mall still to be seen. This kept visitors moving forward, kept the experience feeling open rather than bounded. Diagonal paths served a similar function in larger, more complex layouts. Rather than organizing the building on a simple perpendicular grid, a layout that is easy to understand, but easy to move through quickly, some mall designers introduced diagonal corridors that created unexpected connections between parts of the building. These diagonals disrupted the simple mental map that visitors tried to construct as they moved, creating a mild but persistent sense of spatial uncertainty that encouraged slower, more attentive movement. Multiple levels added another dimension to this complexity. Quite literally, a mall with 2 or 3 floors required visitors to make decisions that a single-level layout did not. Whether to take the escalator or the stairs, which level's version of a corridor to walk, how to navigate between floors when a particular destination was above or below the current level. These decisions introduced friction, but friction of a particular kind. Not the frustrating friction of difficulty, but the engaging friction of choice. Of a building that rewarded exploration, rather than simply accommodating passage. Bridges and overlooks, common features in the multi-level malls of the 1980s, served a specific function within this spatial vocabulary. A bridge crossing over an atrium, or a lower corridor, did several things at once. It created a visual connection between levels that made the building feel unified, a single space rather than stacked independent floors. It offered visitors on the bridge a vantage point from which to see a wider sweep of the mall below, a view that provided orientation, while simultaneously revealing the full extent of what the building contained. And it offered visitors on the lower level a glimpse of activity above, of people moving along an elevated walkway, that suggested depth and life beyond what was immediately visible. These moments of visual connection were important, because they worked against one of the inherent risks of enclosed mall design, the feeling of being inside a box. The more layers of space a visitor could perceive, the more the building felt genuinely large and genuinely complex, rather than simply long and covered. The atrium, with its multiple floors visible from a central open well, was perhaps the most powerful version of this technique, a space that made the building's vertical scale as apparent as its horizontal extent. Lighting played a crucial role in guiding movement as well, though its effects were largely subliminal. The general lighting level in mall corridors was kept consistently bright enough to make merchandise visible and inviting, bright enough to create the sense of an active, energetic environment. But within that overall brightness, individual stores used their own lighting to create moments of heightened intensity. A dramatically lit window display, a pool of warm light falling across a table of folded sweaters, a backlit sign glowing against a darker interior. These were small beacons within the larger environment, each one a gentle pull on the attention of a passing visitor. The direction of this pull was, over the course of a walk through the mall, essentially constant. There was always something slightly brighter, slightly more vivid, slightly more visually interesting, just a little further ahead. Not dramatically so, not in a way that felt insistent or commercial. Just enough to keep the eyes moving forward, to maintain the gentle sense of forward momentum that was the mall's basic rhythm. Natural light, where it entered through skylights above atriums or along the tops of corridor walls, served a different but complementary function. It created a connection to the outside world, to the passage of time, to the quality of the day beyond the building's walls, that made the interior feel less sealed, less artificial. In a building that was, by design, almost entirely disconnected from the external environment, those patches of natural light were psychologically important. They made the space feel inhabitable rather than merely functional. They gave it something of the quality of an outdoor street, which was, after all, exactly what the mall had always been trying to be. It is worth noting that none of these techniques operated in isolation. The genius of the best mall designs of the 1980s was not any single element. Not the anchor system alone, or the curved corridors alone, or the multi-level layout alone, but the way all of these elements worked together as a single coherent system. The anchors generated the traffic. The corridor length ensured exposure. The curves created anticipation. The multiple levels created complexity. The lighting created focus. The seating created pause. The food court created reason to stay. And underneath all of it, steady and invisible, the climate control system maintained the constant, comfortable environment that made extended visits not just possible but genuinely pleasant. Each element reinforced the others. Each decision made in the design of one aspect of the mall supported the goals of every other aspect. The result was a built environment of remarkable internal consistency, one that achieved its aims not through any single dramatic gesture, but through the patient, cumulative effect of 1,000 small decisions, each one pointing in the same direction. There is something almost elegant about it, considered from a distance. The shopping mall of the 1980s was, among other things, a serious piece of environmental design, a considered attempt to shape human experience through the careful arrangement of physical space. The intentions behind it were commercial, certainly, but the tools it used, the manipulation of scale, the orchestration of light, the the management of movement and attention, were the same tools that architects and planners had always used in the design of meaningful public spaces. Victor Gruen, late in his life, expressed some ambivalence about what his ideas had produced. The mall, as it actually developed in the American landscape, was not quite the civic utopia he had imagined. It was a commercial enterprise, and the techniques of spatial design that he had pioneered were deployed in service of that enterprise. But the spaces themselves, those long curving corridors, those open atriums, those bridges and fountains and pools of gentle light, had a quality that went beyond pure commerce. They were, at their best, genuinely inviting places to be. Places that people chose, freely and in enormous numbers, to spend their time. That is perhaps the most interesting thing about the Gruen transfer. It worked not because it overcame people's resistance, but because it offered them something they actually wanted. A comfortable, stimulating, unhurried environment in which the ordinary demands of the day fell away for a while, and the simple pleasure of moving through an interesting space could be enjoyed without particular purpose or plan. The mall gave people permission to wander, and for a few hours on a Saturday afternoon, that was more than enough. There is a particular quality to the experience of riding an escalator in a shopping mall that is unlike riding one almost anywhere else. In an airport or a subway station, the escalator is purely functional. It is a mechanism for moving between levels as efficiently as possible, and the experience of riding it is largely neutral. A brief pause in transit, something to be endured rather than enjoyed. You face forward, you hold the rail, you wait for the moving stairs to deliver you to the next level, and then you continue on your way. In a mall, something different happens. The escalator in a shopping mall is almost never tucked away in a corner or enclosed in a shaft. It is placed almost invariably in the most open and visible part of the building, at the center of an atrium, at the intersection of two corridors, in a space where the full vertical extent of the mall is visible in every direction. And as you ride it, you are not simply moving between floors. You are, for those 15 or 20 seconds, suspended in the middle of the mall's interior world. The stores scroll past. The atrium opens up around you. The floor you have just left drops away below, and the floor you are approaching rises to meet you. You can see, in a single sweep of the eye, more of the building than you can from almost any other vantage point. This was not an accident. It was, like almost everything else about the design of these buildings, a deliberate choice. And understanding why that choice was made, and what it meant for the experience of being inside a mall, requires thinking carefully about what the escalator actually does in a multi-level retail environment. The problem that vertical circulation solves in a shopping mall is, at its core, a problem of attention. A single-level mall is relatively straightforward to navigate. Everything is on one plane. The corridor extends in two directions, the anchor stores are at either end, and the experience of moving through the building is essentially linear, a walk from one end to the other and back again. There are limits to how complex this experience can be, and there are limits, therefore, to how long it can sustain interest. A multi-level mall is a fundamentally more complex proposition. It has more floor area, more stores, more variety. But that additional complexity comes with a challenge. The upper floors are, by definition, less immediately visible than the ground floor. A visitor who enters the mall at street level and begins moving through the ground floor corridor may have no strong reason to go upstairs unless something draws them there. The upper level, however well stocked with interesting retailers, risks being perceived as secondary, an afterthought, a place you go only if you have a specific reason, rather than a natural extension of the mall's primary environment. The escalator, positioned correctly, solves this problem. It makes the upper level visible from the lower one. It makes the act of moving between floors feel natural and easy. Not a significant decision, but simply the next step in the ongoing experience of moving through the building. And it does something more subtle as well. It makes the mall's full vertical scale apparent to anyone standing near it, whether they are about to ride it or not. The placement of escalators in 1980s mall design was governed by principles that had been developed and refined through the construction of hundreds of buildings over the preceding 2 decades. The most important of these principles was visibility. Escalators were almost always positioned in open, central spaces, in atrium wells, at the intersection of major corridors, in any location where they could be seen from a distance and from multiple directions. This visibility served two distinct purposes. For visitors already on one level, visible escalators provided constant orientation, a reminder that the building had more to offer above or below, a clear and easy path to that additional space. The escalator, in this sense, functioned as a kind of invitation. It didn't demand that you go upstairs. It simply made the option apparent, made it feel easy, and made the upper level visible enough that curiosity might take over where intention had not yet formed. For visitors on the escalator itself, the open placement ensured that the ride was not a blank interlude, but an active part of the retail experience. As you ascended or descended, the stores on the level you were moving away from remained in view. The storefronts, the window displays, the activity of shoppers moving through the corridor below, all of it stayed visible for the duration of the ride. You might notice a store from the escalator that you had walked past without registering at ground level. You might see a display from above that caught your attention and sent you back down when you had finished on the upper floor. The escalator, in its open placement, extended the environment's reach in time as well as space. The mechanics of the escalators themselves were, by the 1980s, highly standardized, the product of decades of refinement by a small number of major manufacturers whose equipment had become essentially ubiquitous in commercial buildings throughout the country. The basic operating principle of the escalator had not changed substantially since its invention in the late 19th century. A continuous loop of linked metal steps, driven by an electric motor through a system of chains and sprockets, moved along a fixed inclined track at a steady speed, typically somewhere between 90 and 100 feet per minute in commercial installations of this era. The steps themselves were designed to remain level throughout the ride, regardless of the angle of the incline, through a system of two separate sets of tracks, one for the front wheels of each step, one for the rear, arranged so that the step maintained its horizontal orientation from bottom to top. The handrails moved in synchronization with the steps, driven by the same motor through a separate drive system that kept the rail's surface speed precisely matched to the speed of the step. This synchronization was important not just for safety. A handrail moving at a different speed than the steps would pull or push the rider off balance, but for the quality of the experience. A well-maintained escalator with perfectly synchronized steps and handrails had a smoothness and a steadiness that made the ride feel almost frictionless. In the context of a mall, that smoothness mattered. The escalator was not just a machine for moving people. It was part of the environment, and an environment that aspired to comfort and effortlessness could not afford machinery that felt rough or uncertain. Mall escalators of the 1980s typically came in one of two basic configurations, each suited to different spatial contexts. The parallel configuration placed the up and down escalators side by side, running in opposite directions on parallel tracks. This was the more common arrangement in wider, more open atrium spaces, where the two escalators together formed a visual pair, a clear, balanced statement of the vertical connection between floors. Standing at the base of a parallel escalator pair in a well-designed atrium, with both machines visible simultaneously and the upper level fully open above, gave a strong impression of the building's vertical organization. You could see, all at once, where you were, where you could go, and how to get there. The crisscross configuration, sometimes called the scissors arrangement, alternated the up and down escalators, placing them on opposite sides of the atrium at each floor rather than side by side. This arrangement required visitors to cross the floor to find the escalator running in the direction they wanted, which had the effect of drawing them through additional retail space at each level. It was a subtler piece of planning than it might appear, a way of using the mechanics of vertical circulation to generate additional exposure to storefronts that a direct parallel arrangement might have bypassed. Both configurations had their advocates among mall designers and developers, and the choice between them was often determined by a combination of spatial constraints, budget considerations, and the overall design philosophy of the particular project. But in either case, the underlying intention was the same: to make vertical movement feel natural, visible, and continuous with the general experience of moving through the mall. Elevators occupied a different position in the mall's circulation hierarchy, present in virtually every multi-level building, but serving a more specific and more limited function than the escalators. Where escalators were designed to be visible, central, and inviting, to encourage their use by the general shopping public, elevators were designed primarily to meet the needs of visitors for whom escalators were not a practical option. Shoppers with strollers or wheelchairs, elderly visitors, or those with mobility limitations. Anyone carrying a significant volume of purchases. The Americans with Disabilities Act, which would codify accessibility requirements more formally in 1990, was not yet law during the height of the 1980s mall boom, but accessibility considerations had already become a standard part of commercial building design, and elevator provision was a basic expectation in any multi-story retail environment. The elevators in 1980s malls were typically hydraulic or traction machines of fairly standard commercial specification, functional, reliable, and deliberately understated. They were positioned near the escalators to maintain the coherence of the vertical circulation zone, but they did not share the escalator's open, theatrical placement. An elevator, by its nature, encloses its passengers for the duration of the ride, cutting them off from the visual environment of the building rather than keeping them connected to it. This made the elevator the right tool for accessibility and for the movement of large quantities of goods, but a less effective tool for the ambient retail exposure that the escalator provided so naturally. Some of the more architecturally ambitious malls of the era installed glass-walled elevators, machines whose cabs were partially or fully glazed, allowing passengers to remain visually connected to the atrium space as they traveled between floors. These were more expensive to install and maintain than conventional elevators, and they required careful structural planning to accommodate their placement in open atrium spaces. But in the right building, they added a genuine quality to the vertical circulation experience, a sense that even the act of waiting for an elevator and riding it to the next floor was part of a continuous, connected experience of the mall as a single unified space. The relationship between vertical circulation and sightlines was perhaps the most technically sophisticated aspect of mall design in this era, and it extended well beyond the placement of escalators and elevators. The atrium, which had become by the 1980s a near-universal feature of the regional mall, was in its essence a vertical void, a space deliberately left open through multiple floors to create a visual connection between levels. The stores lining each floor of the atrium faced inward onto this void, their storefronts visible, not just to shoppers on their own level, but to anyone looking across or up or down from any other level of the building. This arrangement transformed the atrium into something that functioned almost like an outdoor urban space, viewed from multiple elevations simultaneously. A shopper on the ground floor could look up and see the storefronts on the second and third levels. A shopper on the third level could look down into the activity on the ground floor: the fountain, the seating area, the flow of people through the central space. And a shopper riding the escalator could see all of it at once, in a slow, continuous pan that took in the full vertical extent of the building in a single, unhurried sweep. This visibility served the mall's commercial purposes, clearly. The more of the building's retail offer that was visible from any given point, the more likely it was that a passing visitor would notice something worth investigating further. But it also served a deeper spatial purpose. It made the building feel genuinely three-dimensional. It gave it depth and height as well as length. And it prevented the enclosed environment from feeling claustrophobic or oppressive. Because a space in which you can always see a long way, in multiple directions and across multiple levels, never quite feels small, regardless of its actual dimensions. There is a certain pleasure in thinking about all of this, in tracing the logic that connected the placement of an escalator to the shape of an atrium to the sightline from a third-floor balcony to the decision a shopper made to walk back downstairs, and look more closely at a window display they had noticed from above. It is the pleasure of seeing a system clearly, of understanding that what appeared to be a simple, comfortable environment was in fact a carefully engineered one, that the ease of movement through a 1980s mall, the naturalness of going upstairs and coming back down, the sense of always being connected to the full life of the building, was the product of decisions made in architects' offices and planning meetings, tested against the behavior of actual shoppers, and refined across hundreds of buildings over decades of practice. The escalator was not just a machine. It was an instrument of spatial connection, a device for keeping the mall's vertical dimension as alive and present as its horizontal one. And the care with which it was placed, oriented, and integrated into the overall design of the building is a reminder that in the best examples of this building type, almost nothing was left to chance. Every building has a center, not always a geometric one, not always the precise midpoint of its floor plan or the exact middle of its longest corridor, but a center in the more important sense, a place that the rest of the building organizes itself around, a place that, when you are in it, makes the logic of the whole structure suddenly clear, where you came from, where you might go next, and why the building exists in the form it does. In the great regional malls of the 1980s, this center had a name, and it had a shape that was, once you had experienced it, immediately and completely recognizable. The atrium. Not every mall had one. The smaller strip malls, the discount centers, the neighborhood retail clusters, these were different animals, organized around different principles. But in the regional mall, the large, enclosed, multi-anchor destination that defined the form at its most ambitious, the atrium was almost always present. And it was almost always the place that made the building feel like something more than a collection of stores connected by corridors. It was the place that made the building feel like somewhere. To understand what an atrium actually does in a mall, not just what it looks like, but what it accomplishes, it helps to think about what the rest of the building is. The corridors of a mall are linear spaces. They have direction. They move you from one place to another, from entrance to anchor store, from one end of the building to the other. Their purpose is fundamentally transitional. They are the connective tissue between destinations, and however carefully they are designed, however skillfully the storefronts are arranged along their length, they remain passages. Places you move through on your way to somewhere else. The atrium is something different. It is not a passage. It is a place. Where the corridor is horizontal and directional, the atrium is vertical and centrifugal. Where the corridor draws you forward along a single axis, the atrium opens in all directions at once, upward through multiple floors, outward toward the ring of storefronts surrounding it, downward to the activity on the ground level below. It is a space that invites you to stop, to look, to take in the full extent of what surrounds you. And in doing so, it performs a function that no corridor, however well designed, can quite replicate. It gives the building a heart. The architectural origins of the mall atrium stretch back considerably further than the shopping mall itself. Covered internal courts, spaces open to the sky or to a glass roof, surrounded on all sides by inhabited floors, had been a feature of significant buildings for centuries. The great covered markets of 19th century Europe, with their iron and glass roofs spanning vast interior volumes, were perhaps the most direct ancestors of the mall atrium. The Galleria Vittorio Emanuele II in Milan, completed in 1877, is among the most celebrated of these. A cruciform-covered street, rising to a magnificent glass dome at its center, lined with shops and cafes on multiple levels. Victor grew in new spaces like this intimately from his years in Vienna, and their influence on his thinking about what the American mall could be was direct and acknowledged. The translation of this European tradition into the American suburban context required certain adaptations. The scale was different. The climate was different. The relationship to the surrounding urban fabric, or in the suburbs' case, the absence of that fabric, was entirely different. But the essential idea survived the translation intact. An enclosed, skylit, multi-story interior space, grand enough to feel significant, open enough to feel alive, surrounded by commercial activity on all sides, and functioning as the social and spatial center of the larger building it occupied. By the time the 1980s arrived, this idea had been refined through 25 years of American mall construction into something highly developed and widely understood. The atrium had become, effectively, a standard component of regional mall design, expected by developers, anticipated by shoppers, and executed with increasing sophistication by the architects and engineers who design these buildings. The experience of entering a mall atrium for the first time, or the first time in a particular building, was one of the more reliably striking spatial experiences available in ordinary American life during this era. You would typically arrive at the atrium from a corridor. The transition could be abrupt or gradual, depending on the design. Some malls announced the atrium with a sudden widening of the space and a dramatic upward sweep of the ceiling. Others led you toward it more gently, the corridor broadening by degrees until the full volume of the atrium space revealed itself around you. But however the transition was managed, the arrival itself had a consistent quality. The ceiling, which in the corridor might have been 10 or 12 feet above your head, suddenly rose to 30, 40, 50 feet or more. The walls, which in the corridor had been close and lined with storefronts, stepped back and opened into the tiered balconies of multiple floors. The quality of light changed. Where the corridor light was even and artificial, the atrium light often included natural daylight filtering down from a glazed roof, creating pools of brightness that shifted slowly through the day as the sun moved across the sky outside. And the sound changed too. The corridor had a particular acoustic character, a contained, somewhat directional sound environment in which the noise of footsteps and conversation was absorbed by the close surfaces of walls and ceiling. The atrium had a completely different acoustic quality. Sound rose into the tall volume above, spread across the open space, mixed with itself in ways that created a gentle ambient wash. Not quite echo, not quite reverb, but a kind of spatial fullness that made the environment feel alive and inhabited even when relatively few people were present. The ground level of the atrium was, in most mall designs, the most intensively programmed part of the entire building. This was the space that visitors first saw when they arrived at the atrium's edge, looking down from an upper balcony or across from a corridor entrance, and it was the space they descended to when they wanted to rest or gather. Its design was accordingly the most considered, the most layered with elements intended to create the feeling of a genuine place rather than simply an open floor. Water was almost invariably present. The atrium fountain, in its many forms, from simple basin and jet arrangements to elaborate multi-tiered sculptural structures, was one of the defining features of the 1980s mall interior. The reasons for its presence were several and mutually reinforcing. Moving water produces sound, a gentle, continuous, essentially neutral sound that filled the acoustic space of the atrium without demanding attention. It produces movement. The constant motion of falling or circulating water gave the eye something to rest on that was never quite still, creating a quality of gentle animation in the center of the space. And it produces a certain psychological effect that is difficult to articulate precisely, but widely recognized. The presence of water in an interior space makes that space feel fresher, more alive, more pleasant to be in. The wishing well dimension of many mall fountains, the practice of throwing coins into the basin for luck, which became so common that mall operators regularly collected and donated substantial sums of money from their fountain pools, added a social and even slightly ritualistic quality to the water feature. The coin in the fountain was a small transaction with the space itself, a tiny act of engagement that connected the visitor to the place in a way that merely walking past could not. Planting was the other major element of atrium ground-level design, and its use in 1980s malls represented a significant commitment of both space and maintenance resources. The plants found in mall atriums during this era tended toward the large and the robust, species capable of thriving in an interior environment, tolerant of the artificial light conditions and the climate-controlled air, substantial enough to register as genuine presence rather than decorative afterthought. Ficus trees, reaching to the second or third floor balcony level, were common. So were large-leaf tropical plants, philodendrons, scheffleras, the various species of palm that could survive and even flourish under the combination of skylight illumination and supplemental artificial light that most atrium environments provided. The effect of this planting, at its best, was to soften the hard geometry of the building's interior. The atrium, stripped of its planting, would have been an impressive space but a somewhat austere one, all glass and steel and polished floor. The introduction of living, growing things into that volume changed its character entirely. It brought the suggestion of a garden, of an outdoor courtyard, of the natural world carefully transplanted into an artificial one. This was, again, deeply consistent with the mall's fundamental aspiration, the creation of an indoor environment that had the best qualities of the outdoors without any of its inconveniences. Seating was arranged around and among the planting and the water features, typically in the form of low benches in materials that harmonized with the overall design palette of the atrium. Polished stone, warm wood, molded fiberglass in neutral colors. The seating was generous enough to accommodate a significant number of visitors simultaneously, because the atrium was understood to function as a rest stop as well as a spectacle. A place where tired shoppers could sit, watch the activity of the space around them, and recover the energy needed for the next hour of exploration. Above the ground level, the atrium's upper floors presented their own carefully considered face to the central void. The balconies running along each upper level were, from the inside of the individual floor, simply the outer edge of the corridor, the railing you reached if you walked away from the storefronts toward the atrium. But from within the atrium space, looking up, they read as layers of activity, as inhabited terraces stacked one above the other, each one populated with moving figures, each one lined with the storefronts and signage of the retailers occupying that level. This layering was enormously effective at creating the impression of density and life. A mall of moderate size, seen from its atrium floor, could feel genuinely urban, a place with depth and height and multiple simultaneous planes of activity, rather than a single extended retail strip. The visual complexity of 3 or 4 floors of balconied storefronts surrounding a central void was, in its way, not unlike looking up at the interior facade of a great civic building, a library, a museum, a covered market hall. The scale was similar, the quality of enclosed vertical space was similar, and the feeling it produced, of being inside something significant, something that had been built with ambition and care, was similar as well. The roof of the atrium was, from an engineering perspective, one of the most demanding elements of the entire building. Spanning the full width of the atrium void, which in a major regional mall might be 60, 80, or 100 feet across, while admitting as much natural light as possible, was a structural challenge that required careful collaboration between architects and structural engineers. The solutions developed during the 1970s and 1980s drew on the traditions of 19th-century iron and glass construction, updated with the materials and techniques of the modern era. Steel space frames, 3-dimensional lattices of steel members, forming a rigid structural mesh, were a common choice for large atrium roofs. They could span considerable distances without intermediate support. They could be fabricated in modular sections and assembled on site, and their relatively slender members minimized the amount of structural material interrupting the flow of light from above. The glazing panels filling the spaces within the frame were typically double or triple glazed to manage heat loss in winter and solar gain in summer, a significant consideration in a building whose entire thermal environment depended on the careful management of its envelope. In some of the more architecturally ambitious malls of the era, the atrium roof became a genuine design statement, a dramatic vaulted structure visible from outside the building as well as from within, expressing the importance of the space it covered in a way that the otherwise relatively plain exterior of most mall buildings did not. These roofs, with their complex geometry and their shimmering glass surfaces, were among the most technically sophisticated elements of 1980s commercial construction. The designers of these spaces understood, perhaps more clearly than they sometimes stated, that they were working in a theatrical tradition as much as a commercial one. The atrium was a stage set, in the most generous sense of that phrase, a constructed environment designed to produce a specific experience in the people who moved through it. The height was theatrical. The light was theatrical. The water and the planting and the layered balconies and the distant sounds of the upper floors were all theatrical. They were elements assembled to create an impression of grandeur, of life, of a space that was genuinely worth being in. And the people moving through that space were not merely consumers navigating a retail environment. They were, in some sense, participants in a kind of ongoing civic performance. They were the figures that animated the stage, that gave the balconies their life, the ground level its activity, the seating areas their purpose. The mall atrium needed people the way a theater needs an audience, and it was designed to attract them, to hold them, and to make their presence within it feel natural and right. That this was achieved in the service of commerce does not diminish it. Great public spaces have always been built by people with interests in the activity they were designed to generate. The covered markets of Europe, the grand hotels, the railway termini with their magnificent concourses, all of them were commercial enterprises that happened, in their finest examples, to produce architecture of genuine quality. The best mall atriums of the 1980s belong, quietly and without pretension, to that tradition. They were spaces where ordinary people went to buy ordinary things and found themselves, briefly and pleasantly, inside something that felt larger than the ordinary. Something with height and light and the sound of moving water. Something that, for a few hours on a weekend afternoon, felt almost like the center of the world. Light is not a neutral thing. We tend to think of it that way, as simply the condition that allows us to see, the background against which everything else becomes visible. But anyone who has spent time paying attention to the quality of light in different environments knows that this is not quite right. Light has character. It has temperature and direction and texture. It changes the way surfaces look and the way spaces feel. It affects mood in ways that are genuine and measurable, ways that architects and designers have understood intuitively for centuries, and that environmental psychologists have studied with increasing rigor in the decades since. The designers of the great regional malls of the 1980s understood this. And one of the most consistent and consequential decisions they made, one that shaped the experience of being inside these buildings more profoundly than almost any other single element, was the decision to bring natural light into the interior. Not just artificial light designed to mimic the appearance of daylight. Not simply bright fixtures and pale surfaces, but actual sunlight, admitted through glass, falling into the interior of the building in a way that changed with the hour and the season and the weather outside. Light that was alive, in the way that only natural light can be. The challenge that skylight design addressed in the mall context was, at its core, a problem of depth. A typical regional mall of the 1980s was a very deep building, where a conventional retail strip along a street has a shallow plan, storefronts facing the street, with service areas behind. A mall is organized around an interior corridor, which means that every part of the building is, by definition, some distance from the exterior wall. The atrium and the central corridors might be 100 feet or more from the nearest exterior window. In a conventional building of this depth, those interior spaces would be entirely dependent on artificial light, sealed off from the sky above as completely as a basement. The skylight resolved this problem by, in the most literal sense, cutting through the roof. By introducing glazed openings in the ceiling plane above the atrium and the main corridors, mall designers created a direct connection between the deep interior of the building and the sky overhead. Sunlight could now fall from directly above into spaces that would otherwise have received none, and the quality of that light, its direction, its warmth, its natural variation through the course of the day, transformed the character of those spaces entirely. The effect on the visitor experience was immediate and significant, and it operated on several distinct levels simultaneously. At the most basic level, the admission of natural light simply made the interior feel less enclosed. One of the consistent psychological challenges of any large, roofed interior space is the potential for what might be called environmental fatigue. The subtle but accumulating sense of confinement that comes from spending extended time in a space that is completely separated from the natural world outside. Natural light, even when admitted indirectly or diffusely, counteracts this tendency. It provides a connection, however attenuated, to the sky, to the movement of the sun, to the broader environmental context of the building. And that connection, even when it is not consciously registered, relieves a tension in the experience of the space that purely artificial illumination cannot address. At a more aesthetic level, natural light gave the mall's interior spaces a quality of visual richness that artificial lighting alone could not produce. Sunlight falling through a skylight onto a polished floor creates reflections and gradients that shift as the light source moves. It picks out the texture of materials, the grain of a stone surface, the sheen of a glazed tile, the fine detail of a decorative feature, in a way that even the most carefully designed artificial lighting scheme cannot fully replicate. It makes the interior feel genuinely inhabited by the natural world, rather than simply designed to resemble it. And at the most practical level, daylight reduced the building's dependence on artificial illumination during the hours when sunlight was available. This was not, in the energy economics of the early 1980s, perhaps the primary motivation for skylight inclusion. Energy efficiency was a less central concern in commercial building design than it would later become. But the reduction in artificial lighting load was a real benefit, and in buildings of the scale of a major regional mall, a meaningful one. The engineering of the skylights themselves was a field of considerable technical complexity, and the solutions developed during the 1970s and 1980s represented a significant advance on what had been possible in earlier eras of construction. The fundamental challenge was one that the Victorian builders of the great iron and glass roofs had already grappled with in their own time: how to admit light through a large glazed area while maintaining the thermal integrity of the building envelope. Glass, even in its modern insulated forms, is a far less effective thermal barrier than an opaque roof. Heat passes through it readily in both directions, into the building on hot summer days, and out of the building on cold winter nights. In a climate-controlled environment as large and as energy-intensive as a regional mall, the thermal performance of the skylight was a genuinely significant engineering consideration. The response, by the 1980s, was the development and widespread adoption of double and triple glazed skylight assemblies, units in which 2 or 3 layers of glass were separated by sealed air spaces that provided meaningful thermal insulation while still admitting substantial quantities of light. These assemblies were considerably more effective thermal barriers than single-pane glass, though still far less effective than an insulated roof panel. Their use represented a deliberate trade-off, accepting some thermal penalty in exchange for the environmental and experiential benefits of natural light. The framing systems holding these glazing assemblies in place had their own engineering demands. A skylight over a large atrium might cover several thousand square feet of roof area. The frame supporting it needed to be rigid enough to resist wind loads and the occasional snow accumulation on its upper surface, while being slender enough to minimize the interruption of light transmission through the glazing. Steel was the universal choice for these frames. It was strong enough to span the necessary distances with relatively slender members, and it could be fabricated with the precision required to maintain the watertight seals around each glazing unit. The geometry of the skylight, its shape, its angle, its orientation relative to the points of the compass, was as carefully considered as its structural and thermal properties, because geometry determined the quality and quantity of light admitted into the space below. A flat horizontal skylight directly above the atrium floor admitted light from directly overhead, the most intense and directional natural light available, particularly in the summer months when the sun was high in the sky. This produced strong pools of direct sunlight on the floor below, with sharp edges that moved slowly across the space through the day. The effect was dramatic and visually striking, but it came with a significant complication. Direct sunlight penetrating deep into an interior space creates intense local heat gain that the building's air conditioning system must then work hard to counteract. In the summer months, a large unshaded horizontal skylight could introduce enough solar heat to represent a substantial additional load on the cooling plant. The response to this challenge took several forms. Tinted glazing, glass with a coating or an integral colorant that reduced solar transmission, could reduce heat gain while still admitting useful levels of diffuse light. Internal shading systems, motorized blinds or louvres that could be deployed during periods of intense direct sun, offered another approach, one that allowed the full benefit of the skylight during overcast conditions or during the lower angle light of morning and evening, while managing the heat gain of direct midday sun. And the geometry of the skylight itself could be used. A sloped or vaulted form that faced away from the direct south sun would admit diffuse skylight from the north or the side while reducing exposure to the most intense direct solar radiation. The most sophisticated atrium skylight designs of the 1980s combined several of these approaches, glazing, geometry, and shading, into integrated systems that managed the balance between light and heat with considerable refinement. The goal was always the same: to fill the interior with the quality of natural light that made the space feel genuinely connected to the outside world, while maintaining the stable, comfortable thermal environment that was the mall's most fundamental promise to its visitors. The light that fell through these skylights did not simply illuminate the atrium floor. It traveled, reflected and scattered by the surfaces it encountered, into the spaces beyond the direct line of sight from the glazed opening. The upper floors of the atrium, bathed in natural light from the skylight above, became secondary light sources for the levels below. Light falling on a pale balcony surface bounced downward into the ground floor. Light reflected from the glass storefronts on the upper levels scattered sideways into the corridors beyond the atrium. The natural light, in this way, propagated through the building well beyond the boundaries of the skylit space itself, diminishing as it went certainly, but carrying something of its quality into spaces that no direct daylight could reach. This propagation was something that skilled mall designers could encourage through careful choices about surface finishes and colors. Pale, reflective surfaces, polished stone floors, light-colored wall finishes, glazed tile, bounced light further and more effectively than dark, absorbent ones. The consistent use of light-toned materials throughout the interior of many 1980s malls was not simply a stylistic preference. It was a strategy for maximizing the reach and the effect of the natural light entering through the skylights above. There was a time of day when the skylit mall atrium showed its full character most clearly, and it was not the busy midday hours when the building was at its most crowded. It was the early morning. Many regional malls opened their doors well before the individual stores began trading, often by 7 or 8 in the morning, sometimes earlier, to accommodate the mall walkers. These were the people, often older adults, who used the mall's long corridors as a venue for daily exercise. They came before the crowds, before the stores opened their gates, before the food court fired up its fryers, and the teenagers arrived in their weekend groups. They came to walk in a safe, comfortable, predictable environment, and the mall welcomed them. In those early hours, the building was quiet in a way it never was during trading hours. The mechanical hum of the HVAC systems was more audible. The sound of footsteps on the polished floor carried further. And the light, the natural light filtering down through the skylights in the morning sun, had a quality that was entirely different from the flattened, uniform brightness of the fully artificially lit building. Morning light through an east-facing or south-facing skylight has a warmth and a directionality that later daylight loses. It falls at an angle, creating shadows and gradients that reveal the three-dimensional form of the space below in a way that overhead midday light does not. It picks up the color of the sky, the soft gold of early morning, the clear blue of a cloudless day, and carries something of that color into the interior. The atrium fountain, catching that morning light, sparkled in a way it never quite managed under artificial illumination. For the mall walkers moving through those early morning spaces, The quality of light was perhaps not something they consciously thought about, but it was unmistakably part of the experience. The reason those corridors felt like a genuinely pleasant place to be at 7 in the morning, rather than simply a covered walking track. The aspiration that the skylight represented, the desire to recreate the quality of an outdoor plaza within a fully enclosed, climate-controlled building, was in some ways an impossible one. Outdoor light is not quite reproducible indoors. The quality of the sky, the sense of open volume above, the complex interplay of direct sunlight and diffuse skylight that fills an outdoor space. These things cannot be fully captured through a glass roof, however carefully designed. But the best skylit mall atriums of the 1980s came closer to that aspiration than might reasonably have been expected. They brought enough of the sky's quality into the interior to genuinely change the character of the space. To make it feel, if not outdoors, then at least not entirely indoors either. To create that particular ambiguous condition, enclosed but not sealed, sheltered but not buried, that was the mall's most distinctive spatial achievement. Standing in the atrium of a well-designed 1980s mall on a bright afternoon, looking up through the glass roof at the sky above, watching the light fall across the tiers of balconies and the surface of the fountain pool below, it was possible to feel, genuinely and without any effort of imagination, that you were somewhere remarkable, somewhere that had been built with real thought and real care, somewhere that understood that people needed more than comfort and variety and convenience, that they needed light. Every empty space inside a building is, from a structural engineer's perspective, a problem to be solved. This might seem like an odd way to think about it. We experience open space as a positive thing, as freedom, as grandeur, as the quality that makes a great interior feel genuinely impressive rather than merely large. The soaring nave of a cathedral, the vast concourse of a railway terminus, the open floor of a sports arena. These spaces move us precisely because they are empty, because the air above our heads is unobstructed, and the view in every direction is uninterrupted, and the building has somehow managed to hold itself up, without filling the interior with the columns and walls that our instinct tells us a structure of that size must require. But the engineer looking at those same spaces sees something different. Every cubic foot of empty air inside a building is a cubic foot of space that cannot be used to carry load. Every column that is removed from an interior, every wall that is eliminated in the name of openness, is a load path that must be redirected, sent somewhere else, through some other structural element, by some other means. The openness that we experience as effortless is, from the structural standpoint, profoundly effortful. It is the result of a great deal of engineering thought directed at a single persistent question. How do you hold up a roof over a space that has nothing underneath it? In the context of the 1980s shopping mall, this question was posed with particular intensity by the atrium. The atrium, as we explored in an earlier segment, was the spatial heart of the regional mall, a multi-story open void at the building's center, surrounded by tiered balconies and topped by a glazed roof. It was the feature that gave the mall its sense of grandeur, its quality of genuine architectural ambition. And it was, from a structural engineering perspective, one of the most demanding elements of the entire building. Consider what the atrium actually represents in structural terms. It is a large hole, a void punched through the building's floor plates at every level, removing the structural material that would ordinarily occupy that space. In a conventional building, the floors are continuous horizontal planes, each one supported by a regular grid of columns rising from the foundations. The loads from above, the weight of the floors themselves, the weight of everything on those floors, the weight of the roof, travel downward through this grid in a straightforward and well-understood way. The structural system is repetitive and efficient, and its behavior under load is relatively easy to predict and design for. The atrium disrupts this regularity entirely. Where the floor plate would ordinarily extend continuously across the building's plan, the atrium introduces a void, a region where the floor simply does not exist. The columns that would ordinarily occupy that region are absent, and the loads that those columns would have carried, the weight of the roof above, the accumulated weight of the floors framing into the atrium perimeter, must now find another path to the ground. Finding that path, and ensuring that it is safe and efficient, and does not compromise the spatial openness that the atrium was designed to provide, was the central structural challenge of mall atrium design. The structural systems developed to meet this challenge drew on a tradition of long-span construction that stretched back well into the 19th century, but applied to it the materials and analytical methods of the modern era. Steel was the material of choice for the primary structure of virtually every major mall atrium of the 1980s. Its combination of high strength, predictable behavior, and relative ease of fabrication and erection made it the natural solution for the long spans and complex geometries that atrium construction required. And by this decade, the American steel construction industry had developed the fabrication and erection techniques needed to produce structural members of the sizes and configurations that large mall atriums demanded. The most fundamental structural challenge of the atrium was the spanning of its roof. The need to cover the open void with a glazed structure that could carry its own weight, resist wind and snow loads, and do all of this without intermediate support from below. The interior of the atrium, by definition, could not accommodate columns. Whatever structural system carried the roof had to do so by spanning the entire width of the void from one side to the other, from one edge of the atrium to the opposite edge, a distance that in a major regional mall might be 60, 80, or 100 feet. The primary structural solution for spans of this magnitude in 1980s mall construction was the steel space frame. A space frame is a three-dimensional structural system, a lattice of steel members connected at nodes to form a rigid self-supporting mesh that can span large distances in two directions simultaneously. Unlike a conventional beam, which carries load by bending between two supports and therefore requires those supports to be relatively close together for the beam to be efficient, a space frame distributes load across its entire area, sharing it among a large number of members working in tension and compression. This distribution allows the space frame to span distances that would be impractical for a conventional beam system, while keeping the depth of the structure, and therefore its visual weight, relatively modest. The practical advantages of the space frame in an atrium context were considerable. Because the structure was three-dimensional, it could be configured in almost any plan shape: rectangular, square, circular, hexagonal, or the complex polygonal forms that some of the more architecturally ambitious atrium designs of this era required. Because its members were slender relative to the span, it admitted large quantities of light through the glazing panels, filling the spaces between its members. And because it could be prefabricated in modular sections in the shop and assembled on site from those sections, it was well suited to the tight construction schedules of commercial building projects. The nodes connecting the space frame's members were, in many ways, the most technically demanding component of the system. Each node was the meeting point of multiple members arriving from different directions in three-dimensional space. Perhaps 6, 8, or even 12 members converging at a single point, each one carrying a different combination of tension and compression depending on the loading condition being considered. The node had to transfer these forces smoothly between members without introducing stress concentrations that might compromise the joint's integrity over time. The proprietary node systems developed by the major space frame manufacturers of this era represented genuine engineering achievements. Compact, precise, and capable of handling the complex force combinations that large-span structures inevitably produced. The roof of the atrium, however demanding, was only one part of the structural problem that the void created. Equally significant was the challenge of the atrium perimeter, the edge condition where the open void met the occupied floors of the mall surrounding it. This perimeter was, in structural terms, a free edge, a place where the floor plate terminated without the support of a wall or column below. And free edges in structural systems require careful management, because the forces that would ordinarily travel through the missing material must be redirected into what remains. The structural element that typically performed this redirection at the atrium perimeter was the transfer beam, a large, heavily loaded beam running along the edge of each floor at the atrium boundary, collecting the loads from the floor framing and the levels above, and channeling them toward the columns at the corners and sides of the atrium. Transfer beams in major mall atriums were substantial structural members, often several feet deep, fabricated from heavy steel sections or from welded plate, designed to carry loads that might represent the accumulated weight of multiple floors of occupied space above. The sizing of these members was one of the more exacting calculations in the structural design of an atrium building. The loads were large and their combination complex. Dead loads from the structure itself, live loads from the occupants and their activities, lateral loads from wind acting on the building's exterior, dynamic effects from the movement of people on the floors above. Each of these load types had to be considered both individually and in combination, and the transfer beam had to be proportioned to carry the worst case that any credible combination could produce, with appropriate margins of safety beyond that. The columns supporting the atrium perimeter were themselves the subject of careful structural consideration. In a conventional building, columns are distributed at regular intervals across the plan, and each one carries a relatively modest tributary area of floor. In an atrium building, the columns at the atrium perimeter carry considerably more, because they are supporting not just the floor area immediately adjacent to them, but the load collected by the transfer beam from the void of the atrium itself. These columns were therefore larger and more heavily loaded than their counterparts in the occupied portions of the building, and their connections to both the foundations below and the transfer beams above required careful detailing. The foundations beneath these heavily loaded columns were similarly demanding. The concentrated loads delivered by atrium perimeter columns were, in some cases, substantially greater than the loads carried by columns elsewhere in the building. Where the soil conditions permitted, spread footings, wide, flat concrete pads that distributed the column load over a sufficient area of bearing soil, were the typical solution. Where soil conditions were weaker or more variable, deeper foundation systems, driven piles, drilled piers, might be required to carry the loads to competent bearing straighter below the surface. The coordination between the structural engineer responsible for the above-ground frame and the geotechnical engineer responsible for understanding the site's subsurface conditions was, in atrium buildings, particularly important. A foundation system that was adequate for the distributed loads of a conventional building might be insufficient for the concentrated loads of the atrium perimeter structure, and this difference had to be identified early in the design process to avoid costly complications during construction. Beyond the atrium itself, the mall presented other long-span structural challenges that required thoughtful engineering solutions. The anchor stores at either end of the building were, by their nature, large open spaces, retail floors that needed to accommodate the flexible arrangement of merchandise displays, checkout counters, and customer circulation without the interruption of structural columns at close intervals. The structural bays in anchor store areas were therefore larger than in the mall's corridors, requiring floor framing systems capable of spanning the greater distances between supports. The main mall corridor, while narrower than the anchor stores, had its own structural demands. The corridor roof, the ceiling above the shopping street, needed to span the full width of the corridor, typically 25 to 35 feet, while remaining shallow enough to allow the overall building height to be managed economically. The steel joists and beams typically used for this purpose were selected for efficiency, members that could achieve the required spans with minimal depth and therefore minimal structural impact on the building's overall height. Where corridors intersected, or where secondary corridors branched from the main spine of the building, the structural system had to accommodate the change in geometry. The intersection of framing running in different directions, the transfer of loads around corners, and through nodes in the building's layout that did not fit neatly into the regular bay grid of the surrounding structure. These were the places where the structural engineer's skill was most clearly visible, or rather, most clearly invisible, since the goal was always to resolve these complexities in ways that left no trace in the finished building. There is a particular quality to structural engineering as a discipline that is worth pausing to appreciate here. The structural engineer's work is, at its best, completely hidden. A beautifully engineered building is one in which the structure does exactly what it needs to do, carries the loads, resists the forces, keeps the building standing and safe and serviceable, while making no demands on the experience of the people inside. The transfer beam above the atrium void, carrying loads that might be measured in hundreds of tons, is concealed above a finished ceiling. The space frame spanning the atrium roof is visible, but its complexity, the intricate force distribution happening within its members at every moment, is not. The foundations, doing the patient work of transferring everything above them into the ground, are entirely invisible. This invisibility is not a failure of communication. It is the achievement. The engineer's job is to solve a problem so thoroughly that the problem disappears, that the space the architect imagined and the visitor experiences seems to exist without structural effort, without the suggestion of difficulty or constraint. The vast open atriums of the 1980s regional mall were, in this sense, some of the most successful structural engineering of their era. They were spaces that felt effortless, that invited visitors to look up at the glazed roof far above, to take in the sweep of the tiered balconies, to experience the full vertical grandeur of the interior, without any reminder of the substantial engineering achievement that made the experience possible. The structure was there, doing its work, carrying its loads, holding the building up against every force that gravity and wind and weather could apply. It was simply doing all of this in complete silence, out of sight, and entirely without calling attention to itself, which was, of course, exactly what it was supposed to do. There is a straightforward physical fact about glass that anyone who has sat near a sunny window on a warm afternoon understands instinctively, even without knowing its technical name. Glass lets light through, and light, when it enters a space and strikes a surface, becomes heat. This transformation, the conversion of solar radiation into thermal energy within an enclosed interior, is one of the most fundamental challenges in the design of any glazed building. It is a challenge that the architects of the great Victorian glass houses understood and managed, imperfectly, through ventilation and shading. It is a challenge that the designers of modern office buildings with their curtain walls of glass face every summer in cities around the world. And it was a challenge that the engineers of the 1980s shopping mall confronted with particular intensity. Because the mall, with its large skylit atriums and its vast enclosed volumes, and its unceasing obligation to remain comfortable for thousands of visitors simultaneously, was a building type for which the management of heat was not a secondary concern, but an absolutely central one. The story of how mall engineers met this challenge is, in many ways, the story of the entire mechanical engineering profession in the latter half of the 20th century. It is a story of systems, large, complex, interdependent systems, designed to impose human comfort on environments that physics, left to its own devices, would make considerably less pleasant. Begin with the basic thermal situation of a 1980s regional mall, considered as a physical object. The building is large. Very large. A typical regional mall of this era might enclose somewhere between 400,000 and 1 million square feet of conditioned floor area, space that must be maintained, year-round, at a temperature and humidity level that feels comfortable to the people moving through it. In the northern states, this means heating through winters of genuine severity. In the southern states, it means cooling through summers of intense heat and humidity. In most of the country, it means both, seasons of heating followed by seasons of cooling, with the mechanical systems that provide each working essentially in opposition to the systems that provide the other. The building's thermal envelope, its walls, its roof, its glazing, is the boundary between the conditioned interior and the unconditioned exterior. Every element of that envelope has a thermal resistance, a capacity to slow the transfer of heat from one side to the other. Insulated walls and roofs have relatively high thermal resistance. Windows and skylights have relatively low thermal resistance. And the larger the area of glazing relative to the total envelope area, the more significant the thermal impact of that glazing becomes. In the mall atrium, The glazed roof covered a substantial area of the building's total envelope. In the summer, solar radiation passing through that glazing and converting to heat within the atrium could raise the interior temperature significantly above what the surrounding areas of the building experienced. In the winter, the relatively poor thermal resistance of even double-glazed units, compared to an insulated roof panel, meant that heat was lost through the atrium roof at a rate considerably higher than through the opaque portions of the envelope surrounding it. Both of these effects, summer heat gain and winter heat loss, had direct implications for the size, configuration, and operating cost of the mechanical systems responsible for maintaining comfortable conditions throughout the building. The response to solar heat gain through atrium skylights operated on two levels: the envelope itself and the mechanical systems behind it. At the envelope level, the glazing assemblies used in 1980s mall skylights incorporated several strategies for reducing solar heat transmission while preserving useful light levels. Tinted glass, available in bronze, gray, and green tints of varying densities, reduced the total solar energy passing through the glazing by absorbing a portion of it within the glass itself. The absorbed energy did cause the glass to warm, and some of that warmth was then re-radiated to the interior. But the overall effect was a meaningful reduction in the solar heat gain compared to clear glass of the same thickness. Reflective coatings, applied to one surface of the glazing unit, offered another approach. These thin metallic films reflected a portion of the incoming solar radiation back out through the glass before it could enter the building, reducing heat gain without the visual darkening effect of tinted glass. The visual appearance of reflective glazing from the outside, the mirrored, silvery quality that became a signature of commercial buildings of this era, was a direct consequence of the reflective coatings operation. From the inside, the view through reflective glazing was somewhat dimmer than through clear glass, but the reduction in glare and heat gain was considered a worthwhile trade. Internal shading systems provided a third layer of control, one that could be adjusted in response to changing conditions rather than being fixed at the time of glazing installation. Motorized blinds, fabric shades, or louved systems mounted within the atrium space could be deployed during periods of intense direct sunlight to block or diffuse the incoming radiation, then retracted when cloud cover reduced the solar load, or when the lower angle light of early morning or late afternoon no longer posed a significant heat gain problem. These systems required their own mechanical and electrical infrastructure, motors, controls, mounting structures capable of reaching across the full width of the atrium opening, and their maintenance in the high, difficult-to-access locations where they were installed was a recurring operational consideration. But no amount of glazing refinement could eliminate the fundamental thermal load that a large skylit atrium represented. The mechanical systems had to carry the remainder, and in a building of mall scale, that remainder was substantial. The heart of the mall's cooling system was the chiller, a refrigeration machine that extracted heat from water, producing chilled water that could then be distributed through pipes throughout the building to cool the air. The chillers used in major regional malls of the 1980s were large, industrial-scale machines, centrifugal or absorption units capable of producing hundreds, or even thousands of tons of cooling capacity. A ton of cooling, in the terminology of the HVAC industry, represents the ability to remove 12,000 British thermal units of heat per hour, roughly the rate at which a ton of ice melts in 24 hours. A large regional mall might require 2,000 tons of cooling capacity, or more at peak summer conditions, with the atrium and its solar heat gain representing a significant fraction of that total. The chillers were located in dedicated mechanical plant rooms, typically in basement levels or at the building's perimeter, away from the occupied spaces above. These rooms were substantial in themselves, large enough to house not just the chillers, but the associated cooling towers, pumps, piping systems, electrical switchgear, and control equipment that together constituted the cooling plant. The noise and vibration of the operating machinery made mechanical plant rooms unsuitable for any occupied use, and they were typically lined with acoustic insulation and separated from adjacent spaces by substantial walls and floor assemblies. The chilled water produced by the chillers was distributed through an extensive network of insulated pipes running through the building's ceiling and wall cavities, branching from the central plant room into every part of the building, reaching the air handling units that used the chilled water to cool and dehumidify the air supplied to the occupied spaces. These pipe networks, in a major regional mall, might extend for miles in total length. Their installation was a substantial construction undertaking, requiring careful coordination with the structural frame, the electrical systems, and the other mechanical trades working in the same ceiling spaces. The air handling units, the machines that actually conditioned and delivered the air that mall visitors breathed, were the distributed components of the mechanical system, located throughout the building rather than in a single central plant room. Each air handling unit consisted of several functional sections, housed within a large sheet metal cabinet. A filter section removed dust and particulate matter from the air passing through it. A cooling coil, a heat exchanger through which the chilled water from the central plant circulated, cooled and dehumidified the air to the required supply conditions. A heating coil, supplied with hot water from the building's boiler plant, provided heating capacity for the winter months and for morning warm-up after the building had been unoccupied overnight. And a fan, often a large centrifugal fan driven by an electric motor, moved the air through the unit and into the supply duct system, serving the zones beyond. The duct systems carrying conditioned air from the air handling units to the occupied spaces were, in aggregate, among the most extensive components of the entire building. Rectangular sheet metal ducts, ranging from small branches serving individual stores to large main ducts carrying thousands of cubic feet of air per minute, ran through ceiling spaces and wall cavities throughout the building. The installation of these ducts, their fabrication, their coordination with structural members and other services competing for the same ceiling space, their insulation, their connection to the grills and diffusers, through which air was finally delivered to the occupied spaces below, represented a major component of the overall construction effort. The return air system, the ducts and pathways through which used air was drawn back to the air handling units for reconditioning, was equally extensive, though less visible in the finished building. Much of the return air path in mall buildings of this era used the ceiling plenum, the space between the structural floor above and the suspended ceiling below, as an open return air pathway, avoiding the need for fully ducted return systems in every zone. This approach reduced the quantity of return ductwork required, but it demanded careful management of the ceiling plenum as a controlled airspace, sealed from adjacent plenums serving different zones, and maintained under the correct pressure conditions. The division of the mall into thermal zones was one of the most important decisions in the mechanical engineering of these buildings, and it was one that required careful coordination between the mechanical engineer, the architect, and the retail leasing team. Different parts of the mall had fundamentally different thermal characteristics. The anchor stores, with their large floor areas, their own internal heat-generating equipment, and their potentially very large numbers of occupants, had cooling and heating demands quite different from those of the small specialty shops in the mall corridor. The food court, with its extensive cooking equipment producing both heat and moisture, required more intensive ventilation and cooling than any other area of the building. The cinema complex, with its periods of very dense occupancy followed by periods of near emptiness between showings, required a mechanical system flexible enough to respond to these rapid changes in load. The response to this complexity was zoning, the division of the building into discrete areas, each served by its own air handling system and controlled independently of the others. A major regional mall of the 1980s might be divided into dozens of mechanical zones, each one-sized and configured for the specific thermal characteristics of the space it served. The anchor stores were almost invariably treated as separate mechanical systems from the mall itself, a consequence, not just of their different thermal loads, but of the commercial structure of the mall lease, which typically required anchor tenants to be responsible for their own mechanical systems. The anchor store's HVAC equipment was owned, operated, and maintained by the anchor tenant, and it interfaced with the mall's central plant only at the point where the anchor's chilled water or condenser water system connected to the mall's distribution network, if it connected at all. Many anchor stores operated entirely independent mechanical plants, with their own chillers and boilers located in dedicated plant rooms within the anchor's own building footprint. The atrium itself presented a particular zoning challenge that occupied the attention of mechanical engineers working on mall projects throughout this era. The atrium was, by its nature, a tall space potentially 40 or 50 feet from floor to skylight. Tall spaces present a consistent thermal problem that engineers refer to as stratification, the tendency of warm air to rise and accumulate at the top of the space, while cooler air settles near the floor. In a conventional room of normal ceiling height, the temperature difference between floor and ceiling is small enough to be unimportant. In a tall atrium, stratification can produce a temperature difference of 10 degrees or more between the occupied zone near the floor and the air near the roof, with the warm air at the top being of no comfort benefit to the people at the bottom, and the solar heat gained through the skylight adding further warmth to the already warm upper zone. Managing this stratification required mechanical strategies that went beyond the simple supply and return systems adequate for lower space areas of the building. Destratification fans, large, slowly rotating ceiling fans, or jet fans mounted at high level within the atrium, could be used to gently mix the air column, breaking down the temperature gradient and bringing some of the cooler floor-level air up into the warmer upper zone. Supply air could be introduced at multiple levels within the atrium at the ground floor, at intermediate balcony levels, and at high level near the skylight, with the distribution between these levels adjusted to manage the temperature gradient throughout the full height of the space. The control of atrium thermal conditions was, in many ways, as much an art as a science during this period. The computational fluid dynamics tools that would later allow engineers to model airflow and temperature distribution in complex spaces with considerable precision were not yet available in the forms needed for routine design use. Engineers worked instead from physical principles, from the accumulated experience of similar projects, and from the monitoring and adjustment of systems in operation, making changes in response to observed conditions rather than predicted ones. The boiler plant that provided heating to the mall during the winter months was the thermal mirror of the chiller plant, equally large, equally mechanically complex, equally demanding of space, maintenance, and operational attention. Gas-fired boilers, producing hot water distributed through a building-wide pipe network to the heating coils of the air-handling units, were the standard heating plant configuration for mall buildings of this era in most parts of the country. The boilers were located in the same mechanical plant rooms as the chillers, or in adjacent spaces, and their flues, the exhaust pathways for the combustion gases produced by the burners, rose through the building to discharge safely above roof level. The sizing of the heating plant was governed by the building's heat loss calculation, an accounting of all the pathways through which heat escaped from the conditioned interior to the cold exterior during the winter design condition. The walls, the roof, the glazing, the floor, each element of the envelope contributed to the total heat loss rate, weighted by its area and its thermal resistance. The mechanical plant had to be capable of replacing heat at the rate it was lost, maintaining the interior at the design temperature, even under the most severe outdoor conditions the building was likely to encounter. In the northern states, where winter design temperatures could fall well below zero, this was a demanding requirement, one that drove boiler plant sizes and distribution system capacities that could seem, to a visitor experiencing the building in the comfort of a summer afternoon, almost incomprehensibly large. The battle against cold was invisible in summer, just as the battle against heat was invisible in winter. But the plant rooms told the story honestly, with their ranks of boilers and chillers and pumps, and tanks, the full scale of the engineering commitment required to make the mall's effortless comfort a physical reality. And yet, for all its scale and complexity, the climate system of the 1980s regional mall did something genuinely remarkable. It worked. Day after day, season after season, year after year, it maintained that fundamental promise that whatever was happening outside, whatever the temperature or the humidity or the weather, the interior of the mall would remain comfortable. Not dramatically, not in a way that called attention to itself, but consistently, reliably, and almost without exception. The people walking those corridors in July felt it in the cool air on their skin. The mall walkers arriving on a January morning felt it in the warmth that met them at the door. The families spending a Saturday afternoon in the food court felt it as a kind of background ease the absence of discomfort that allowed them to forget the weather entirely and concentrate on the simple pleasure of being somewhere together. That absence was the system's greatest achievement. Not the machinery itself, not the chillers and the boilers and the miles of ductwork, but the condition those machines created and maintained. A condition so steady, so reliably present, that it disappeared from awareness entirely, and left behind only the experience it was designed to produce. Effortlessness, comfort, the sensation of a world that had arranged itself, quietly and without fuss, entirely for your benefit. There is a quality that the best designed buildings share, regardless of their size or purpose or the era in which they were built. It is a quality that is almost impossible to perceive directly, because it is not expressed in anything visible or tangible or present in the ordinary experience of moving through the building. It does not contribute to the atmosphere of the space, or the quality of its light, or the comfort of its temperature. It is not something that visitors notice, or appreciate, or remark upon. And yet it is, in a very real sense, the most important thing about the building. It is the quality of being safe. Not safe in the general sense of being well-built and structurally sound, though that matters too. Safe in a more specific and more urgent sense. Safe in the event of fire. Safe in the conditions that, for most buildings on most days, never arise, but that, when they do arise, determine whether the people inside have the time and the means to get out. The shopping mall of the 1980s was, from a fire safety perspective, one of the most challenging building types that engineers and code officials of the era had to contend with. And the systems developed to protect these buildings, the sprinklers, the detectors, the smoke control systems, the fire-rated assemblies, the carefully planned egress routes, represent some of the most consequential safety engineering of the entire decade. To understand why fire safety in a mall was so complex, it helps to think about what properties of the building made it, from a fire protection standpoint, genuinely difficult. Begin with size. A regional mall of the 1980s was an enormous building, potentially 1 million square feet or more of occupied floor area, housing hundreds of individual tenants, visited by thousands of people on a busy day. The sheer scale of the building created challenges that did not exist in smaller structures. Evacuation distances were long. The number of people who might need to move from interior spaces to exits simultaneously was very large. And the diversity of uses within the building, retail stores, restaurants, cinemas, storage areas, service corridors, created a wide variety of potential ignition sources and fuel loads that had to be accounted for in any comprehensive fire protection strategy. Then consider the openness. The atrium, which gave the mall its sense of grandeur and its quality of connected, multi-level space, was from a fire safety perspective a significant liability. In a conventional multi-story building, each floor is separated from the floors above and below by fire-rated floor assemblies, horizontal barriers of sufficient thermal resistance and structural integrity to slow the spread of fire and smoke from one level to the next. These separations give occupants on unaffected floors time to evacuate, give firefighters time to mount a response, and limit the total area of building exposed to fire conditions at any given moment. The atrium eliminated these separations for the floors facing the central void. A fire starting on the ground floor of an atrium, or spreading smoke from a fire elsewhere in the building into the atrium void, could expose all floors simultaneously to smoke and potentially to fire. The vertical chimney effect of the tall, open space could accelerate the upward movement of hot gases with alarming speed. And the large number of people on upper floors, looking down into an atrium filling with smoke, represented an evacuation challenge of a different order from anything that conventional multi-story building design had previously had to address. Smoke was, in the understanding of fire safety engineers by the 1980s, the primary threat to life in most building fires. This understanding had been developed through painful experience, through the investigation of fire incidents in which the fire itself caused relatively limited damage, but smoke traveled rapidly through connected spaces, incapacitating occupants well removed from the seat of the fire before they had any opportunity to evacuate. Smoke inhalation, not burns, was responsible for the majority of fire fatalities in building fires. And in a space like a mall atrium, where the vertical geometry actively promoted the upward spread of smoke through a connected multi-story volume, the potential for rapid smoke filling of occupied spaces was a genuine and serious concern. The response to this understanding, in the design of 1980s mall buildings, was the development of what were known as smoke control systems. Mechanical systems specifically designed not to suppress fire, but to manage the movement of smoke within the building in ways that protected the occupants' means of escape. The fundamental principle of mall atrium smoke control was the creation of what engineers called a smoke reservoir, a strategy in which the rising plume of smoke from a fire was allowed to accumulate in the upper portion of the atrium volume, above the heads of occupants on the surrounding floors, while the lower portion of the space remained relatively clear of smoke for long enough to allow evacuation to proceed. Achieving this required overcoming the natural tendency of smoke to spread laterally as well as upward, to spill over balcony edges and spread into the corridor spaces of upper floors, and to do so actively, using mechanical ventilation rather than relying on passive physical barriers. The atrium smoke control system typically consisted of a combination of large exhaust fans mounted at the top of the atrium space, capable of withdrawing smoke from the upper reservoir at a controlled rate, and make-up air inlets at lower levels, admitting fresh air to replace the exhausted smoke and maintain the clear layer near the floor where occupants were moving toward exits. The sizing of these smoke control systems was one of the more technically demanding calculations in the fire safety engineering of mall buildings, and it drew on a body of research that was, in the early 1980s, still relatively new. The key variable was the smoke plume, the column of hot gas and combustion products rising from the fire. As the plume rose through the air above the fire, it entrained surrounding air, drawing in cooler ambient air from the sides and mixing it into the rising column. This entrainment progressively cooled and diluted the smoke, but it also dramatically increased the volume of the plume at higher elevations. A fire that produced a relatively modest volume of hot gases at its source might, by the time its plume had risen 30 or 40 feet to the level of the atrium roof, have entrained enough ambient air to represent a volume flow of tens of thousands of cubic feet per minute. The exhaust fans at the top of the atrium had to be capable of removing smoke at least as fast as the plume was delivering it to the upper reservoir. Otherwise the reservoir would spill over the balcony edges, and the clear layer protecting evacuating occupants would be lost. The calculation of the required exhaust rate depended on the assumed size and heat release rate of the design fire, the hypothetical worst-case fire scenario that the system was sized to manage, and on the geometry of the atrium space, which determined how much entrainment occurred as the plume rose through the height of the void. These calculations required the engineers to make judgment calls about fire scenarios that were inherently uncertain. How large a fire should the system be designed to control? Where in the atrium or its surroundings might that fire originate? How quickly would occupants notice the fire and begin to evacuate? The answers to these questions were not determined by physics alone. They involved assumptions about human behavior, about the effectiveness of detection and alarm systems, and about the response time of the building's occupants and the fire service. Getting them right was a matter of engineering judgment, as much as calculation. The sprinkler system was the first line of active fire suppression in the mall. The system designed to detect and attack a fire at its earliest stage, before it grew large enough to challenge the smoke control systems or overwhelm the building's means of egress. Automatic sprinklers had been a feature of commercial buildings for well over a century by the 1980s, but their application in the specific context of mall atriums presented challenges that conventional sprinkler design had not previously had to address. The fundamental operating principle of a sprinkler is straightforward. A heat-sensitive element, typically a glass bulb filled with a liquid that expands when heated, holds a plug in the sprinkler head closed until the air temperature around it reaches a threshold level. When the threshold is reached, the element fails, the plug releases, and water flows through the open head, discharged in a spray pattern designed to wet the surfaces below and suppress the fire. In a space of normal ceiling height, this system works well. The hot gases from a fire rise quickly to the ceiling, heat the sprinkler heads in the immediate vicinity of the fire, and activate them in time to apply water to the burning surfaces before the fire grows too large. But in a tall atrium, the dynamics are different. The hot gases rising from a fire cool as they rise, entraining surrounding air and losing heat to the atrium volume, so that by the time they reach the ceiling of a 40 or 50-foot atrium, they may have cooled sufficiently that they no longer carry enough heat to activate conventional sprinkler heads. The sprinklers at ceiling level might not operate at all, even with a significant fire burning at the atrium floor 40 feet below. The engineering response to this problem involved several approaches. In some atrium designs, sprinkler heads were installed not just at the ceiling, but at intermediate levels, at the balcony edges of each upper floor, positioned to provide coverage across the floor of the atrium below without requiring activation at the ceiling level. In others, specially calibrated sprinkler heads with lower activation thresholds were used at the atrium ceiling, accepting that they would activate later in the fire development than standard heads, but ensuring that they would eventually activate when the fire grew sufficiently. The coordination of these different approaches with the smoke control system, ensuring that the activation of ceiling sprinklers did not disrupt the smoke reservoir that the exhaust system was trying to maintain, required careful integrated design. Fire detection systems, the networks of smoke detectors, heat detectors, and manual call points distributed throughout the building, formed the warning layer of the fire protection strategy, providing early notice of developing fire conditions to both the building's occupants and its management systems. By the 1980s, ionization and photoelectric smoke detectors had become standard components of commercial building fire alarm systems, capable of detecting the products of combustion at concentrations well below those visible to the human eye. In mall buildings, these detectors were installed throughout the occupied spaces, in ceiling spaces and mechanical plant rooms, in storage areas and service corridors, anywhere that a fire might develop before it was noticed by occupants. The signals from individual detectors were collected by a central fire alarm panel, a control and monitoring system that could identify the location of any activated detector, sound the building's alarm system, and initiate the automatic responses programmed into the building's safety systems. These automatic responses were, in a major mall building, considerably more complex than simply sounding an alarm. They included the shutdown of the building's normal HVAC systems, which, if left running, could spread smoke through the ductwork into areas remote from the fire, and the simultaneous activation of the smoke control systems, which would begin exhausting smoke from the atrium and pressurizing stairwells to keep them clear of smoke for evacuating occupants. The stairwell pressurization systems, fans that supplied clean air to enclosed stairwells at a pressure slightly above that of the surrounding spaces, were an important component of the overall smoke control strategy. By maintaining a positive pressure in the stairwells relative to the smoke-filled spaces outside, these systems prevented smoke from infiltrating the primary means of egress, keeping the escape routes clear for the full duration of an evacuation. Physical fire barriers, the rated walls, floors, and doors that compartmentalized the building into zones of manageable size, were the passive layer of the fire protection strategy, providing a level of protection that did not depend on mechanical systems operating correctly. In the mall context, the most important of these barriers were the separations between individual tenant spaces. Each store in the mall corridor was typically required to be separated from its neighbors by walls of a specified fire resistance rating. Walls capable of resisting the passage of fire for 1 or 2 hours, giving occupants of adjacent stores time to evacuate before the fire could breach the barrier between them. These fire-rated tenant separations were constructed above the finished ceiling level as well as within the visible wall below, because fire could spread through the ceiling plenum above if the separation was not continuous through the full height of the construction to the structure above. The fire stopping of penetrations through these separations, the sealing of every pipe, duct, and electrical conduit passing through a rated wall, was a detailed and labor-intensive process that required careful inspection to ensure completeness. The corridor itself, the public mall space between the tenant storefronts, was typically separated from the individual stores by the storefronts themselves, which in many buildings included fire shutters or rolling grills capable of closing automatically in a fire alarm condition. These closures, when deployed, compartmentalized the mall corridor from the individual tenant spaces, limiting the spread of fire from a store into the public circulation space, and providing a degree of protection for people evacuating through the corridor. The means of egress, the exits through which occupants could leave the building in an emergency, were the subject of careful planning that influenced the building's layout from its earliest design stages. Building codes of the 1980s established requirements for the number of exits available to occupants of any given area, for the maximum travel distance from any point in the building to the nearest exit, and for the width of exit doors and corridors. Requirements determined by the number of people expected to use them simultaneously in an emergency. In a building as large and as densely occupied as a regional mall, these requirements had real implications for the placement of exits, the sizing of exit corridors, and the design of the building's perimeter, where exit doors discharged to the exterior. The placement of exit doors in a mall building was, from a design standpoint, a somewhat awkward constraint. The building's perimeter wall, the exterior facade, was, in most mall designs, a largely blank surface. The design intention was to draw visitors inward, toward the anchors and the atrium, not outward toward exits. The commercial logic of the mall pushed against the safety logic of the building code. The exits needed to be there, needed to be accessible, and needed to be clearly marked. But they also needed to be unobtrusive enough that they did not undermine the contained, inward-focused atmosphere that the mall's designers had worked to create. The resolution of this tension was typically pragmatic rather than elegant. Exit doors placed at regular intervals around the perimeter, marked with illuminated exit signs required by code, connected to the interior by short exit corridors, or simply opening directly from the main mall corridor. The exit signage itself, the familiar green or red illuminated signs that dotted the ceilings of every mall in America, became such a ubiquitous feature of the interior environment that it effectively disappeared from conscious awareness, noticed only when needed, and otherwise simply part of the visual texture of the space. The full fire protection system of a 1980s regional mall. The sprinklers, the detectors, the smoke control systems, the rated separations, the egress routes, the alarm and control panels, represented an investment of engineering effort and construction cost that was, in aggregate, very substantial. It was also investment that, in the ordinary course of the building's life, produced nothing visible or tangible. The systems sat dormant, tested periodically, inspected regularly, maintained carefully, but contributing nothing to the mall's atmosphere, its commercial performance, or the experience of the people moving through it. They were pure insurance, pure preparedness, the embodiment of the principle that the most important thing a building can do is to protect the people inside it, even in conditions that the building was never intended to experience. This principle, that safety is not an afterthought, but a fundamental dimension of building design, woven into the fabric of the structure from its earliest conception, was perhaps the most important lesson that the fire safety engineering of the 1980s mall encoded, not just for malls, but for the entire practice of building design. The atrium was beautiful. The skylights were uplifting. The escalators were elegant. The HVAC system was invisible. But underneath all of it, running through the walls and the ceilings and the mechanical systems, was a network of protection that made everything else possible. A network that, on the vast majority of days, did nothing at all. And that was exactly what it was designed to do. There is a particular kind of intelligence that expresses itself not in the solving of a single problem, but in the anticipation of problems not yet arrived. It is the intelligence of the builder who frames a wall with enough depth to accommodate the plumbing that will be needed in 5 years when the building's use changes. Of the engineer who sizes a structural beam not just for today's loads, but for the additional floor that the client has not yet decided to add. Of the designer who routes a conduit through a concrete slab, not because anything needs to run through it now, but because if something ever does, the conduit will already be there. This kind of forward-looking intelligence, call it design resilience or built-in adaptability, is one of the less celebrated qualities of good building design. It produces no visible results in the finished building. It generates no drama during construction. It is invisible to the people who occupy the building and opaque to the clients who paid for it. But it is the quality that determines, more than almost anything else, whether a building remains useful and viable as the years pass and the world around it changes. In the 1980s regional shopping mall, this quality was not merely desirable. It was essential. Because the mall, more than almost any other building type of its era, was a building that expected to change, continuously, substantially, and without interruption to the ongoing life of the structure it was changing within. The fundamental commercial reality of the mall was one of constant tenant turnover. Retail is a competitive, volatile business. Stores that thrive in one decade may struggle in the next. Concepts that seem fresh and appealing when a mall first opens may feel dated 5 years later. Chains expand and contract. Small businesses open and close. The retail landscape shifts, sometimes gradually, sometimes with startling speed, and the mall's tenant roster shifts with it. A regional mall that had been open for 10 years in 1985 might have replaced a significant fraction of its original tenants. One that had been open for 20 years might, in its details, be almost unrecognizable compared to its opening configuration. Each of these tenant changes involved physical work on the building itself. A new tenant moving into a space previously occupied by a different retailer almost never simply accepted the space in its existing condition. The previous tenant's fixtures, fittings, and interior arrangements were removed. The space was reconfigured to suit the new occupant's specific requirements. Different floor plan, different ceiling treatment, different lighting scheme, different service requirements. The process was, in miniature, a construction project. And in a mall with hundreds of tenant spaces, cycling through changes on a continuous basis, these miniature construction projects were happening somewhere in the building essentially all the time. The question that this reality posed to the building's designers, before a single tenant had moved in, was how to construct a building that could accommodate this continuous churn of physical change without requiring that the entire mall shut down every time a tenant space was reconfigured. The answer was a design philosophy built around flexibility, around the systematic provision of the infrastructure and the structural conditions needed to allow individual spaces to change while the larger building continued to function normally around them. The tenant space itself, the raw shell that the mall provided to each retailer before they fitted it out for their own use, was the primary unit of this flexible system. In most mall lease arrangements of the 1980s, the landlord provided what was known as a vanilla shell, a basic, unfinished space bounded by the demising walls separating it from adjacent tenants and the mall corridor, with a concrete or structural floor, a structural ceiling above, and a set of utility connections brought to a specific point within or at the boundary of the space. The tenant was then responsible for everything inside. The partition walls, the ceiling finishes, the lighting, the flooring, the storefront design, and the connection of their internal systems to the utility stubs provided by the landlord. This division of responsibility was not simply a commercial convenience. It was a design strategy that built flexibility into the building's basic operating model. by concentrating the tenant-specific improvements in the interior of the space and keeping the building's primary infrastructure at the shell level. The arrangement ensured that a complete tenant replacement could be accomplished without touching the building's structural or mechanical backbone. The demising walls remained in place. The utility connections remained in place. The fire protection infrastructure remained in place. Only the interior, the tenant's own investment in fixtures and finishes, was removed and replaced. The demising walls themselves were typically constructed of steel stud framing with gypsum board facing, a system that was quick to erect and, crucially, quick to modify. The partitions were non-structural, carrying no building loads, which meant they could be moved or removed without engineering review or structural consequence. When a single tenant space was subdivided to accommodate two smaller retailers, or when two adjacent spaces were combined for a larger one, the demising walls could be adjusted accordingly. New walls built, existing walls relocated, the configuration of the space reshaped to match the requirements of the incoming occupancy. The utility systems serving the tenant spaces were designed with this expectation of change built into their fundamental configuration. Electrical service was brought to each tenant space through a distribution system that terminated at a dedicated panel board within or adjacent to the space. A panel from which the tenant's electrician could run circuits to whatever locations within the space the tenant's layout required. The capacity of this panel was sized not just for the tenant's anticipated current use, but with headroom for future tenants whose electrical demands might be higher. A space that had been occupied by a small boutique clothing retailer, with modest lighting and minimal equipment loads, might be taken over by a consumer electronics store or a restaurant, both of which would draw substantially more electrical power. The panel capacity and the feeder circuit bringing power to it needed to be adequate for a range of possible future occupancies, not just the current one. Plumbing rough-ins presented a more physically demanding flexibility challenge, because water supply pipes and drain lines are embedded in or below the concrete floor slab, a location that makes them both expensive to install and difficult to modify after the fact. The response to this challenge in mall construction was a combination of strategic pre-installation and practical compromise. In areas of the building likely to be occupied by food service tenants, near the food court, in locations where restaurants were anticipated, floor drains, grease traps, and plumbing rough-ins were installed as part of the base building construction, accepting that some of these provisions might not be needed by the first tenant, but would be available to subsequent ones. In areas intended primarily for dry retail, clothing, shoes, accessories, plumbing rough-ins were typically minimal, limited to restroom connections at the rear of the space. The challenge arose when a food service tenant wanted to occupy a space originally configured for dry retail, or vice versa. Converting a dry retail space to a food service use required the installation of plumbing infrastructure, drain lines, grease interceptors, water supply, that had not been anticipated in the original construction. This work involved cutting through the concrete floor slab, routing new drains beneath it, and patching the slab after the new infrastructure was in place. It was disruptive, time-consuming, and expensive, the kind of conversion work that mall management teams tried to minimize through careful leasing strategy, placing food service tenants in spaces already equipped for their needs, and avoiding the cost of major infrastructure changes wherever possible. The HVAC system's accommodation of tenant change was, in many ways, the most elegantly solved of the flexibility challenges. The standard approach in 1980s mall construction was to bring a base level of conditioned air to each tenant space through a main distribution duct in the ceiling space above, terminating in a connection point at the space boundary. The tenant's HVAC contractor would then connect this supply to whatever internal duct arrangement the tenant's layout required, extending branches to different parts of the space, sizing diffusers for the desired air distribution pattern, and installing whatever supplemental systems the tenant needed for their specific use. This arrangement allowed the internal air distribution of each tenant space to be completely reconfigured with each new tenant, without touching the main supply ductwork serving the broader zone. The main duct remained in place. The connection point remained in place. Only the internal branches and diffusers, which were the tenant's property anyway, were removed and replaced as tenants changed. The main supply air quantity available to each space was determined by the zone's air handling unit, which was sized for the expected occupancy mix of the zone it served. When a new tenant with significantly higher ventilation requirements, a restaurant or a fitness center, or any use with high occupant density, moved into a space previously occupied by a lower demand retailer, the zone's air handling unit might need to be rebalanced or supplemented to provide the increased airflow the new tenant required. This rebalancing was a mechanical engineering task, involving the adjustment of dampers in the distribution system to redirect airflow from lower demand spaces to the higher demand space, or the addition of supplemental air handling equipment if the zone's total capacity was insufficient. The service corridors running behind the tenant spaces were among the most important, and most completely invisible, elements of the mall's flexibility infrastructure. In most regional mall designs of the 1980s, the tenant spaces along the main corridor did not extend all the way to the building's exterior wall. Behind each row of stores ran a service corridor, a passage, typically 8 to 12 feet wide, that connected the rear of each tenant space to loading docks at the building's perimeter and provided access to the utility infrastructure serving the tenants. The service corridor was the mall's backstage, the working infrastructure of the building that visitors never saw and tenants rarely thought about during normal trading hours, but that was essential to the functioning of both the individual stores and the mall as a whole. Merchandise arrived at the loading docks and was moved through the service corridors to the stock rooms at the rear of each tenant space, keeping the delivery traffic entirely separate from the customer areas of the mall. Waste was removed by the same route. Maintenance staff moving through the building to service mechanical equipment, replace lighting, or respond to repair calls used the service corridors to reach their destinations without passing through occupied retail spaces. For the purposes of tenant change and renovation, the service corridor served an additional critical function. It provided the pathway through which construction workers, materials, and equipment could be moved to a space being renovated without disrupting the adjacent tenants or the mall shoppers. A tenant fit-out in progress, with its dust and noise and construction traffic, was entirely contained behind the tenant's own demising walls and accessed exclusively through the service corridor. From the front, the space might present a hoarding board to the mall corridor, a temporary partition decorated with graphics or announcements about the new tenant arriving, while behind it, the construction proceeded in complete isolation from the shopping activity, continuing on either side. This separation was not simply a matter of convenience. It was what made continuous operation possible. A mall in which tenant renovation work spilled into the public areas, with construction materials blocking corridors, dust infiltrating the air, and workers moving through the shopping environment, would have been a significantly less pleasant place to visit. The service corridor system ensured that the mall's public face remained clean, calm, and consistent while the constant churn of tenant change proceeded behind it. The expansion of the mall itself, the addition of new wings, new anchor stores, or new entertainment facilities to a building already in operation, presented a structural and systems integration challenge of a different order from the routine tenant change management. Mall expansions were common throughout the 1980s, as successful properties looked to increase their retail area, attract additional anchor tenants, or add new uses in response to changing consumer expectations. And almost all of these expansions had to be accomplished while the existing mall continued to trade, because the commercial cost of closing a major regional mall for the months required to complete a significant expansion would have been prohibitive. The structural challenges of expanding an operating mall began with the connection between the new construction and the existing building. The existing structure had been designed and constructed as a complete system, its foundations sized for the loads it carried, its structural frame detailed for the connections it made, its perimeter walls designed as the building envelope. Extending the building required opening the envelope, connecting new foundations to existing ones, and tying new structural framing into an existing frame that was still carrying live loads from the operating building above. These connections required careful engineering. The existing structure could not be destabilized or overloaded during the connection process. The foundations of the new addition needed to be designed to avoid imposing new loads on the existing foundations, loads that the existing foundations had not been designed to carry. And the structural connection between new and existing framing needed to be made in a way that transferred forces smoothly between the two systems without creating stress concentrations at the junction. In practice, expansion connections were often designed with deliberate discontinuities, expansion joints between the new and existing structures that allowed the two to move independently under load, avoiding the complex force interactions that a fully rigid connection would have required. These joints, accommodating the differential settlement and thermal movement that would inevitably occur between a new structure and an established one, were detailed with flexible seals that maintained the weather tightness of the building envelope at the junction while permitting the necessary relative movement. The integration of new mechanical and electrical systems with existing ones was, in many respects, as demanding as the structural integration. An existing mall's mechanical systems had been designed and balanced for a specific building configuration. Adding new floor area meant adding new heating and cooling loads. Adding a new anchor store meant connecting a new, large mechanical system to the building's central plant, or ensuring that the new anchor's independent systems had the capacity and infrastructure they needed without drawing on the existing plant beyond its designed capacity. Adding new retail area meant extending the existing electrical distribution system, or installing new switchgear and distribution panels to serve the addition independently. In each case, the engineers responsible for the expansion had to work from the as-built documentation of the existing systems, the drawings and specifications recording what had actually been installed during original construction, to understand the capacity available for expansion. They had to assess whether the existing chiller plant had reserve capacity for the new cooling loads, or whether additional chillers were needed, whether the existing electrical service had headroom for the new demand, or whether a new utility service entrance was required, whether the existing fire alarm system could be extended to cover the new area, or whether a new panel was needed. This assessment was often more difficult than it might appear, because the as-built documentation of an operating building was rarely a perfect record of its actual condition. Systems had been modified since original construction. Equipment had been replaced with units of different capacity. Informal changes had been made in the field during the original construction that were never recorded in the drawings. The engineers working on the expansion had to conduct careful field surveys, physically tracing systems through ceiling spaces and plant rooms, to establish the true current state of the building before they could reliably design the expansion's integration with it. The capacity for change that was built into the 1980s regional mall, the flexible utilities, the adaptable structural bays, the service corridors, the vanilla shell leasing model, reflected a sophisticated understanding of what these buildings actually were. They were not static objects. They were not monuments, fixed in form at the moment of their completion and thereafter unchanging. They were dynamic commercial environments, whose value depended on their ability to remain current, relevant, and responsive to the constantly shifting landscape of retail. A mall that could not change was a mall that would age rapidly, that would find itself, within a decade or two, inhabited by tenants and configured in ways that no longer matched what shoppers wanted or what the market required. The flexibility built into these buildings was, in this sense, a form of investment in their own longevity. By making change easy, by designing the infrastructure of the building to accommodate, rather than resist, the continuous renovation and reconfiguration that the retail environment demanded, the designers and engineers of the 1980s mall were extending the useful life of their buildings well beyond what a more rigid approach would have permitted. There is something quietly admirable about this. It represents a kind of humility in design, an acknowledgement that the building's designers could not know what the future would require, and that the best they could do was to create a framework robust enough to accommodate whatever that future brought. Not a perfect building, fixed and complete, but a resilient one. A building that could absorb change, adapt to new demands, and continue to function. Season after season, tenant after tenant, decade after decade, as the world around it moved on. There is a thought experiment worth sitting with for a moment before we begin. Imagine that you could peel back the surfaces of a 1980s regional shopping mall. Not destroy it, not dismantle it, but simply make its internal workings visible. The finished ceilings become transparent, revealing the ductwork and pipe runs and electrical conduit packed into the plenum above. The walls become glass, showing the steel stud framing and the insulation and the fire-rated assemblies layered within them. The floors lift away to reveal the foundations below, the spread footings and the grade beams, and the carefully compacted earth on which everything above rests. The structural members glow with the forces running through them. The compression in the columns, the tension in the roof beams, the complex stress distributions in the transfer elements at the atrium perimeter. What you would see, in this imagined transparency, is not a building in the ordinary sense. It is a system. A vast, interlocking, mutually dependent system of systems, each one performing its own function, each one connected to and dependent on the others, all of them working simultaneously and continuously to produce a single unified result. That result is not a temperature, or a lighting level, or a structural performance metric. It is something more elusive and more important than any of those things. It is an experience. We have spent the last several hours moving through the individual systems that made the 1980s regional mall function. The structural systems that held its vast open spaces together. The mechanical systems that kept its air cool and clean. The smoke control and fire protection systems that kept its occupants safe. The flexible infrastructure that allowed it to change continuously without interruption. The skylights that brought natural light into its deep interior. The escalators that connected its levels while keeping its visual environment intact. Each of these systems, considered alone, is a technical achievement worthy of attention. The engineering required to span a 100-foot atrium, without intermediate columns, to maintain a comfortable temperature across 1 million square feet of enclosed space, to manage the movement of smoke through a multi-story void in a fire emergency. Each of these is a genuine problem, solved with genuine skill, by people who understood both the physics and the human realities of the situations they were designing for. But the more interesting story, the one that takes shape when you step back from the individual systems and look at how they work together, is not a technical story at all. Or rather, it is a technical story that is simultaneously something else. Something about the relationship between engineering and human experience. About the way that physical systems, correctly designed and correctly integrated, can produce effects that seem to have nothing to do with engineering. Effects that belong to the realm of atmosphere, of feeling, of the particular quality of being somewhere that makes you want to stay. Consider the atrium, and what it actually represents when understood as an integrated system rather than a single design element. From an architectural standpoint, the atrium is a statement of spatial ambition. The decision to create, at the center of the building, a volume of air large enough to feel genuinely grand. From a structural standpoint, it is a void in the building's floor plates, requiring the careful redistribution of loads around its perimeter and the spanning of its roof with a long-range structure capable of carrying itself and the glazing it supports across an open distance. From a mechanical standpoint, it is a challenging thermal environment, a tall, heavily glazed space that gains solar heat in summer and loses warmth in winter, subject to stratification, requiring specialized smoke control systems and carefully considered air distribution strategies. From a fire safety standpoint, it is a vertical pathway through which smoke could potentially spread rapidly between levels, demanding exhaust systems and sprinkler configurations quite different from those adequate for conventional multi-story construction. Each of these perspectives is valid. Each describes something real and important about what the atrium is and what it demands of the building around it. But none of them, alone, captures what the atrium actually does in the experience of the people moving through it. What the atrium does, in the experience of those people, is make them feel that they are somewhere remarkable, that they have entered a space with genuine scale and genuine quality, that the building they are in was made with care, with an understanding that people need more than functional shelter, that they respond to height and light and the sound of water and the sense of open space above them in ways that go beyond the merely practical. This feeling, this sense of being somewhere worth being, is the integrated output of all those separate systems working together. The structural achievement that created the open void. The glazing and skylight engineering that filled it with natural light. The mechanical engineering that maintained its temperature and managed its acoustics. The smoke control engineering that made it safe. None of these systems produced the feeling alone. Together, they made it possible. The relationship between natural light and mechanical load is a particularly clear example of the integration that the best mall designs achieved. More glazing in the atrium roof meant more natural light in the interior, a quality that made the space feel more open, more connected to the outside world, more genuinely pleasant to inhabit. But more glazing also meant more solar heat gain in summer and more heat loss in winter, additional mechanical loads that the HVAC system had to handle, with corresponding increases in plant size, energy consumption, and operating cost. The design of any specific atrium skylight was therefore not a decision that could be made by the architect alone, or by the mechanical engineer alone, or by the structural engineer alone. It was a negotiation between these disciplines, a search for the configuration that maximized the experiential benefits of natural light while keeping the mechanical penalties within acceptable limits. The geometry of the glazing, its orientation, its framing, its thermal specification, all of these variables were adjusted in response to the competing demands of different engineering systems, seeking the balance point at which the total design performed best across all its dimensions simultaneously. This kind of multidisciplinary optimization, finding solutions that serve the goals of multiple systems at once, rather than optimizing each system independently, is the essence of integrated building design. And it was in the best mall projects of the 1980s, practiced with real sophistication. Not because it was glamorous or celebrated, it was largely invisible work, happening in the coordination meetings and the shared drawing sets of the design team, rather than in the finished building, but because the building's performance depended on it. The same integration operated between the structural system and the spatial experience of the building. The decision to use a steel space frame for the atrium roof, rather than a more conventional beam and column system, was a structural decision, driven by the spanning requirements and the modular geometry of the glazing system above. But it was also an experiential decision. The space frame's slender, repetitive members produced a very different visual quality in the finished roof than a heavier, more conventional structure would have. The pattern of light and shadow that the frame cast on the atrium below, shifting through the day as the sun moved across the glazed panels above, was a direct consequence of the structural geometry. The sense of lightness and transparency that the best atrium roofs conveyed was not simply an aesthetic quality that the architect had chosen. It was the structural system making itself visible, and the structural system's geometry happening to produce an aesthetic quality that served the building's experiential goals. This congruence between what the structure needed to be to do its job and what the architecture needed to look like to achieve its effects is one of the things that distinguishes genuinely successful building design from design that merely solves its technical problems. When the structural solution and the spatial solution point in the same direction, the building has a quality of inevitability, of having been made the right way, the only way, with nothing arbitrary or forced about its form. The fire safety systems, too, were more deeply integrated into the overall building design than their purely protective function might suggest. The smoke control strategy for the atrium, the decision to manage smoke by maintaining a clear layer at low level while exhausting smoke from the upper reservoir, was a fire safety decision driven by the physics of smoke movement and the goal of protecting evacuating occupants. But it was also a spatial decision, because the strategy only worked in a space with sufficient height above the occupied zone to accommodate the smoke reservoir without immediately threatening the people below. A low-ceilinged space could not be protected by the same strategy. There simply was not enough vertical distance between the occupants and the ceiling to establish a meaningful clear layer. The atrium's height, which was primarily a spatial and aesthetic decision, the desire to create a genuinely grand interior volume, was therefore also a fire safety asset. The grandeur and the safety reinforced each other. A taller atrium was both more impressive to be in and easier to protect with a viable smoke control strategy. The aesthetic ambition of the design and the fire safety engineering of the design pointed in the same direction. These moments of alignment, when different systems and different design disciplines converge on the same solution for different reasons, are among the most satisfying things in building design. They suggest that the building has found a configuration that is, in some fundamental sense, right for what it is trying to do. That the form the building has taken is not arbitrary, but necessary, the natural consequence of all the forces and requirements bearing on the design finding their equilibrium. There is a word that comes up repeatedly when people try to describe the experience of being in a well-designed interior, a word that points at something real, even though it resists precise definition. The word is atmosphere. Atmosphere is not any single quality. It is not the lighting level, or the temperature, or the acoustic character, or the spatial proportions of a room. It is the combined effect of all of these things, and of things beyond them, things that are harder to name. The quality of the surfaces, the rhythm of the structural elements, the way sound behaves in the space, the relationship between the occupied zone and the volume above it, the presence or absence of natural light, and its direction and quality when it is present. Atmosphere is what you feel when you walk into a space that is working, that has been made with sufficient care and sufficient integration, that all its elements pull in the same direction and produce an experience greater than any of them could produce individually. It is the thing that makes you slow down, look around, and feel, without quite being able to say why, that you are somewhere worth being. The great mall atriums of the 1980s had atmosphere. Not all of them. Not the ones built too quickly, or too cheaply, or with insufficient attention to the integration of their systems. But the best of them did. And the atmosphere they had was not an accident, and it was not simply the result of good architectural taste. It was the product of engineering, of the structural decisions, and the mechanical decisions, and the lighting decisions, and the fire safety decisions, all happening to converge on a result that worked as a unified whole. The engineering made the experience possible. The experience justified the engineering. And somewhere in the relationship between the two, the building became more than the sum of its systems. It is worth pausing here, near the end of our journey through these buildings, to think about what it means to engineer an experience. We are comfortable with the idea that engineers design systems, that they calculate loads and size equipment and specify materials and detail connections. This is what engineering is, the application of physical knowledge and mathematical analysis to the solution of practical problems. But the engineers who worked on the great regional malls of the 1980s were doing something that sits alongside this technical work and is inseparable from it. They were making decisions about the height of the atrium, the transmittance of the glazing, the throw distance of the supply air diffusers, the activation temperature of the sprinkler heads. That determined not just the technical performance of the building, but the quality of the experience of being inside it. They were shaping, through the medium of physical systems, something as intangible as how a person felt on a Saturday afternoon. This is not unique to mall design. Every building does it. Every space that humans inhabit is shaped by the engineering decisions embedded in its construction, and those decisions affect the experience of the space, whether or not anyone intended them to. But the mall, with its explicit ambition to create an environment that people would choose to spend time in, an environment that competed, in the leisure economy of 1980s America, with every other claim on people's attention and time, made the connection between engineering and experience unusually direct and unusually legible. The mall needed people to want to be there. And wanting to be somewhere is, in the end, a physical response to a physical environment. To the temperature of the air, and the quality of the light, and the sound of water, and the height of the ceiling, and the smoothness of the floor underfoot. To all the things that the engineers had designed, sized, specified, and integrated into a system whose ultimate output was not a number on a performance chart, but a feeling in a human body. That feeling, at its best, was one of ease. Not excitement, exactly. The mall was not trying to excite. Not luxury, precisely. These were public spaces, open to everyone, designed for ordinary use on ordinary days. But ease. The particular quality of an environment in which nothing is difficult, nothing is uncomfortable, nothing demands more effort than the person moving through it is willing to give. An environment in which the air is the right temperature, and the light is the right brightness, and the floor is smooth, and the ceiling is high, and the sounds are neither too loud nor too quiet, and there is always, somewhere nearby, a place to sit. This ease was engineered. Every part of it. The temperature was the output of a chiller plant, and an air handling system, and a carefully balanced duct network. The light was the output of a skylight design, and a glazing specification, and an artificial lighting system, calibrated to complement the natural light above. The smoothness of the floor was the output of a structural slab, designed with tight deflection limits, and a finish specification chosen for durability and cleanability. The height of the ceiling was the output of a structural decision about bay depth, and a spatial decision about the proportions needed to make the atrium feel genuinely grand. None of it happened by itself. All of it was made. And here, perhaps, is the most interesting thing about the engineering of the 1980s shopping mall. It was engineering in service of something that engineering alone cannot create. The systems could create the conditions for a good experience. They could eliminate the frictions and discomforts that would prevent a good experience. They could produce the light, the temperature, the structural openness, the acoustic quality, the safety that the experience required. But the experience itself, the particular quality of a Saturday afternoon in a well-made mall, with its light and its sounds and its sense of a world comfortably contained, was not a product of the engineering. It was a product of people being in the space that the engineering made possible. The mall needed its visitors as much as its visitors needed the mall. The atrium needed people looking up at it for its height to mean anything. The fountain needed people sitting near it for its sound to matter. The skylights needed the shifting attention of a human eye for the quality of their light to register as beautiful rather than simply bright. The engineering created the stage. The people animated it. And somewhere in that meeting, between the carefully designed physical environment and the unplanned, unpredictable, thoroughly human activity of people simply going about their day, something happened that neither the engineers nor the architects could quite have planned for. A place came into being. Not a building. A place, with its own particular character, its own atmosphere, its own claim on the memories and affections of the people who spent time in it. A place that, for all its commercial purpose and its engineered comfort, was also something more personal than that. Somewhere people went not just to shop but to be, to spend a few hours in a world that asked nothing of them except their presence, and offered in return the simple, underrated pleasure of a comfortable and interesting space. That is what the engineering of the 1980s shopping mall ultimately produced. Not a system, not a structure, not a performance metric. A place worth being in. And on a quiet evening, when the crowds have thinned and the light through the skylights has softened to the long gold of late afternoon, and the fountain is still running, and the air is still cool, and the corridors stretch away in both directions into a gentle, comfortable distance, that is still exactly what it feels like. We have come a long way tonight. We began at the entrance, at those glass doors, and the particular moment of stepping through them. The moment when the outside world fell away, and the interior world of the mall rose up to receive you. Cool air, soft light, the distant sound of water, the sense of a space that had arranged itself, quietly and without visible effort, entirely around the comfort of the people moving through it. It felt simple. It felt natural. It felt, in the way that only the most carefully made environments ever quite managed to feel, effortless. We know now that it was none of those things. Behind those glass doors was a machine. Not a machine in the narrow sense. Not a single device with a single purpose, housed in a single location and operated by a single switch. But a machine in the broader and more interesting sense. A system of systems. An assemblage of structural elements and mechanical components and safety infrastructure and spatial strategies, all of them running simultaneously, all of them connected to and dependent on one another, all of them directed toward a single unified purpose. That purpose was you, the person walking through the door. Your comfort, your orientation, your safety, your experience of the space around you. Every decision that had been made in the design and construction of the building. Every calculation, every specification, every coordination meeting between engineers and architects and contractors had ultimately been made in service of the moment when a person walked through those doors and felt, without quite knowing why, that they were somewhere good. The machine made that feeling possible, and it did so by making itself invisible. Think about what was happening in the fabric of the building during an ordinary Saturday afternoon visit to a 1980s regional mall. Beneath your feet, the structural slab rested on foundations designed to carry the accumulated weight of everything above. The building itself, its contents, and the thousands of people moving through it simultaneously, and to distribute that weight into the earth below without settlement or distortion. The structural frame above transferred the loads of the roof and the upper floors around the edges of the atrium void, channeling them through transfer beams to the columns at the perimeter, and from there down through the building to the foundations beneath. Above your head, concealed by the finished ceiling of the corridor, ran an arterial network of sheet metal ductwork. Main supply ducts branching into secondary branches, each one calibrated to deliver a specific quantity of conditioned air to a specific zone of the building. Air handling units in mechanical rooms throughout the structure drew return air back from the occupied spaces, passed it through filters, cooled and dehumidified it over chilled water coils, and returned it to the supply system. A continuous cycle of conditioning and distribution that ran without pause for every hour the building was open, and for many hours it was not. In the mechanical plant rooms, the chillers ran. Large, precise refrigeration machines, extracting heat from circulating water and rejecting it through cooling towers on the roof above, moving thermal energy from inside the building to outside it, maintaining the temperature differential between the comfortable interior and whatever the summer afternoon was doing beyond the walls. In winter, boilers took their place in the thermal management of the building, burning gas to heat water, distributing warmth through the same pipe network that carried coolth in summer, maintaining the interior against the cold with the same steady, patient persistence. High in the atrium, the smoke control system waited. Exhaust fans at the upper level of the void, make-up air inlets at lower levels, pressure differentials maintained in the stairwells. All of it dormant, all of it ready, monitoring the signals from the detector network spread through every part of the building, prepared to respond in the first moments of a fire with a coordinated mechanical response designed to keep the escape routes clear and the occupants safe. And through the glazed panels of the atrium roof, natural light fell. Filtered through double-glazed units selected for their balance of light transmission and thermal resistance. Falling across the space frame's slender members to cast its shifting pattern of light and shadow on the surfaces below. Reaching down through the full height of the atrium void to the fountain at its base, where the water caught it and scattered it in small moving points of brightness across the surrounding floor. All of this, simultaneously, continuously, invisibly. The people moving through the building knew none of it. They knew the cool air on their skin, and the brightness of the light, and the sound of the fountain, and the smoothness of the floor. They knew the gentle pull of curiosity around the curve of the corridor, the satisfaction of finding what they had come to buy, the pleasure of sitting for a while near the atrium railing and watching the activity of the space below. They knew the particular quality of time in a mall, its tendency to pass without urgency, to stretch without boredom, to accommodate an afternoon without demanding anything of it. They did not know about the chiller plant or the transfer beams, or the smoke exhaust fans, or the fire-rated demising walls, or the carefully calibrated thermal transmittance of the skylight glazing. They were not supposed to know. The entire achievement of the engineering was precisely this unknowing. The production of an experience so complete and so consistent that it left no trace of the effort that created it. This is the deepest kind of craft. Not the craft that announces itself, that draws attention to its own skill and invites admiration for its difficulty, but the craft that conceals itself so thoroughly in its result that the result seems simply to exist, naturally and inevitably, as if it could not have been otherwise. As if comfortable air and even light and structural openness on this scale were simply what the interior of a large building was like. As if it required nothing. The 1980s was, in many ways, the decade that perfected this concealment. The mechanical systems of this era had matured to the point where they could reliably maintain comfort conditions across building volumes that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations of engineers. The structural systems were sophisticated enough to create interior spans and heights that gave architects the spatial freedom to realize genuinely ambitious visions. The fire safety systems were developed enough to protect these large, open buildings with a confidence that earlier, more ad hoc approaches had not been able to provide. And the building industry, the contractors, the fabricators, the specialist subcontractors in each technical discipline, had developed the skills and the organizational capacity to bring all of these systems together in a single, coordinated construction effort. The regional shopping mall was the beneficiary of all of this accumulated technical capability. It was a building type that required the full range of what mid to late 20th century engineering could offer, and it received it. The result was a building type of remarkable performance, reliable, comfortable, safe, and adaptable in ways that its predecessors could not have been, and that many subsequent building types have not quite matched. It was also, at its best, a building type of genuine spatial quality. The great mall atriums of this era, with their height and their light and their layered balconies and their fountains and their carefully managed atmosphere, were real achievements of environmental design. They were spaces that people genuinely wanted to be in, that held their own against every alternative available in the leisure economy of the time, that generated loyalty and affection and memory in the people who used them. This was not despite the engineering. It was because of it. There is a version of this story that treats the engineering of the shopping mall as something slightly sinister, as the machinery of manipulation, deployed in service of commercial interests, designed to keep people inside and spending money against their better judgment. The Gruen transfer, the windowless environment, the carefully calibrated atmosphere of controlled comfort. This version is not entirely wrong. The tools of environmental design that the mall deployed were real, and their effects on human behavior were real, and they were used in service of a commercial enterprise that benefited from extended visits and unplanned purchases. But this version is also incomplete, because the people who went to the mall were not passive recipients of a manipulation they were powerless to resist. They were people making choices, choosing to spend a Saturday afternoon in an environment they found pleasant, choosing to browse stores they found interesting, choosing to eat in a food court and sit near a fountain and ride an escalator and look up through a skylight at the sky above. These were small choices, ordinary choices. But they were choices. And the fact that millions of people made them, repeatedly and willingly, across decades of mall going, suggests that what the mall offered was something they genuinely wanted. What they wanted at bottom was a place. A comfortable, interesting, safe, and welcoming place where the demands of the outside world fell away for a while, and the simple activity of being somewhere pleasant could be enjoyed without particular effort or particular purpose. The engineering of the mall created that place. And the people who went there, who animated its corridors and filled its food courts, and looked up at its atriums and threw coins in its fountains, made it real. The malls of the 1980s are aging now. Many of them have closed, victims of changing retail patterns, of the rise of online shopping, of the suburban demographic shifts that have reshaped the landscapes they once anchored. The buildings that remain face challenges that their designers could not have anticipated, in a retail environment that has changed more in the last 20 years than in the previous 40. But the engineering that made them does not age. The principles that govern their structural design, their mechanical systems, their fire protection, their spatial organization, these are not period pieces. They are the accumulated knowledge of a profession working at the height of its powers, applied to a building type that demanded the best it could offer. That knowledge lives on in the buildings that followed, in the shopping centers and the airports and the convention centers, and the cultural institutions that drew on the same engineering traditions and pushed them further. And for those of us who grew up in the era of the great regional mall, who spent childhood Saturdays in those corridors, who remember the particular quality of that cool air and that fountain sound and that long, curving view down a corridor to the anchor store at the far end, the engineering lives on in something less technical than knowledge. It lives on in memory, in the specific, sensory memory of a place that felt, when you were in it, like a complete world. A world with its own atmosphere, and its own rhythms, and its own particular quality of light on a winter afternoon, when the sun came through the skylight at a low angle and fell across the atrium floor in long golden bars. That light was engineered. The air was engineered. The space was engineered. The safety was engineered. The feeling of ease and welcome and comfortable enclosure, that was engineered too, in its way. Produced by the patient, careful, largely invisible work of people who understood that a building is not just a structure but an experience, and that making the experience right required getting everything else right first. So the next time you find yourself in a large enclosed space, in a mall, or an airport, or a museum, or any building that manages to feel simultaneously vast and comfortable, open and safe, bright and calm, take a moment to think about what is happening in the fabric of the building around you. The air moving through the grill above your head, conditioned by machinery you will never see to a temperature chosen for your comfort. The structure holding the roof above you across a span that required careful engineering to achieve. The light falling from above, admitted through glazing selected for the balance it strikes between brightness and thermal control. The sprinkler heads in the ceiling, waiting patiently for conditions that will, with any luck, never arrive. The exit signs glowing softly at the edges of your vision, marking routes you hope you will never need to use. All of it running, all of it working, all of it pointed at the same quiet goal. To make you comfortable, to keep you safe, to give you, for a few hours on an ordinary day, a place that feels easy to be in. That is what the hidden machine does. That is what it has always done. And as you settle in for the rest of the night, as the images of those long corridors, and those sunlit atriums, and those quietly running fountains drift through the edges of your mind, perhaps you can carry with you a small, calm appreciation for the engineering underneath it all, for the chillers running in their plant rooms, for the space frames spanning their quiet distances above empty atriums, for the smoke exhaust fans waiting in the dark at the top of atrium voids, patient and ready and still, for all the invisible work of all the invisible systems that made, and still make, the effortless possible. Sleep well.